When you imagine a cult, you probably picture white robes and candlelit rooms hidden deep in a forest somewhere far from civilization. And sometimes that's exactly what it is. But sometimes a cult is just a convincing voice telling you that everything is going to be better if you just buy a cheap course. And sometimes it truly is selling everything you own to join a higher cause. The shape changes, the promises change, but the core always seems to stay the same. Every cult needs three things: a charismatic leader, a method of manipulation, and eventually, more often than not, a great tragedy. So this is the story of three cults on three different continents that all followed a similar playbook and all eventually failed horribly. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. And I'm glad you're here. We're diving into three different cults. It's been a minute since we did a three-parter. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go mock fight on the highway, slam the brakes, and bust through this windshield into these three cults together. So before I started this channel, I had every what if you can imagine. What if no one watches? What if I can't keep up? What if this whole thing falls apart? And turns out a lot of you showed up. And if you've been thinking about turning your own passion into a business, Shopify is the partner that helps quiet those doubts. And for those of you who don't know, Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses worldwide. In fact, it's 10% of all e-commerce in the United States, which is wild. But with hundreds of ready-to-use templates, you can build a stunning online store that actually looks like you. And Shopify is packed with AI tools that handle product descriptions, page headlines, and even product photography. So you can focus on the work you love, and you can leave that other stuff up to Shopify. But what if you get stuck? Well, Shopify's award-winning 24/7 customer support has you covered. With everything between inventory, payments, analytics, it all lives in one place. So you can sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/cccm. Go to shopify.com/cccm. I've been using Shopify for years now, and I absolutely love it. So head to shopify.com/cccm to start today. Thank you so much to Shopify for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. So to understand what happened in the quiet Swedish village of Knutby, you first need to understand the man in the center of it. Helge Arnold Fossmo was born on July 27th, 1971, to Norwegian parents in Björneborg, a small village in Värnamo County, Sweden. And his family wasn't particularly religious, but when Fossmo was around 10 years old, something shifted. He joined the scouting organization of the Mission Covenant Church in his village, and by age 11, he had declared himself a born-again Christian. And it was a decision that would define the rest of his life. And in high school in Kristinehamn, he threw himself into religious community work, volunteering at a Christian youth cafe and becoming deeply embedded into that world. And at 17, he met a young woman named Helena Johansson, the woman who would become his wife eventually. And 2 years later, in 1989, he joined the Pentecostal church in Kristinehamn, where Helena was also a member. And after graduating, he enrolled in Karlstad University to become a science teacher, but eventually dropped out and returned to teach at his old school in Björneborg. So by 1993, he was deepening his involvement with charismatic Christian movements, specifically a group called Jaspis, which drew its inspiration from Olfekman Livetsord, which was a megachurch built around the Word of Faith movement. And the Word of Faith theology taught that prayer was a direct pipeline to God's provision. Physical healing, financial prosperity, emotional restoration, any desire you could name, if you prayed for it according to God's plan, would be given to you. If only it was that easy. But Fossmo was drawn in completely to this. But a few months later, he left Jaspis and rejoined the Pentecostal church, but this time as a youth pastor in Kristinehamn. And it was here in 1993 that Fossmo would meet a woman who would change everything. a woman named Åsa Waldau. Now, Åsa Waldau was born on October 26, 1965, and she had trained at a Pentecostal Bible school in Stockholm studying theology, and by 1990 had been hired as a youth pastor at a Pentecostal church in Uppsala. But that chapter didn't last, and she was actually forced to resign following her divorce and other tensions within the church. And she then moved to Knutby, a small village east of Uppsala, where she came to live with the Waldau family and eventually married their son Patrick in June of 1994. But long before that marriage, in March 1992, she had already begun part-time work at the Pentecostal congregation in Knutby, a small traditional church that had been established during the Pentecostal revival in Sweden back in 1921. So before Waldau arrived, it was an unremarkable congregation, but under her influence, that changed pretty quickly. And she climbed the church's hierarchy with startling speed, and then made a move that should have raised every alarm bell in the building. She declared herself the Bride of Christ. That's a pretty good promotion. But this wasn't just symbolic language, nay. It's a title that carries specific theological meaning, traditionally given to the church as a whole. But Waldau taught it literally. She was, and she claimed, the woman destined to marry Christ himself. And everyone in the congregation were basically invited as guests to her wedding, her and Christ's wedding. So her theology took on an intensely eschatological direction, focused on the end of days, on death and divine judgment. A tale as old as time for cults, right? And she preached a doctrine of pre-tribulationism, the belief that faithful believers would be raptured, lifted bodily into the clouds before the Great Tribulation arrived. And Waldau expected she would be taken to heaven like the Virgin Mary, united with her bridegroom, Jesus Christ. But she wanted a bigger audience for this message. The cult leaders are never just satisfied with like a couple people. They're like, I need a mega church, So she began traveling to other Pentecostal communities across Sweden, personally recruiting people to relocate to Knutby permanently. And the congregation grew somehow, but devoted followers arrived convinced they had found something rare, a community chosen by God himself. And Helge Fossmo was among those drawn in, the guy we were talking about before Waldau. So when he first met Waldau in 1993, there was an immediate spiritual connection. And by 1997, he had uprooted his family entirely, moving to Knutby with his wife, Helena, and their 2 children in August of that year. And he and Waldau began working side by side, launching a month-long training school for young Christians across Sweden that ran 3 times a year. And Fossmo also founded a missionary organization called Aid for Nations, which organized Bible schools in India and Hong Kong. And together, they were building something formidable. And Fossmo claimed he received messages from God directly. How convenient! Every time, without fail. They don't even, I swear, all these cult leaders, I feel, really get together and they're like, we're going to do these same 10 things. And they really do. They all claim they're like prophets and that they're the middleman to God. They're like the assistant to God. And they're like, whatever he says it through me. And it's not my business, If he says I got to take 80 wives, I got to do it as he just told me to. I don't make the rules. Anyway, I'll take that one. I'm just kidding. No, but seriously, he said that he had a direct line to God. And Waldau claimed to be God's chosen bride, as we know. So each one reinforced the other's authority, and their combined influence over the congregation became total. And the congregation became increasingly isolated from the broader Pentecostal network around it. And by the late 1990s, other churches in the region were growing alarmed. And pastors from Knutby had stopped attending shared events, and longtime members were quietly leaving, put off by the shifting leadership style. And the families of people still inside were reaching out to church authorities even, desperately trying to maintain contact with loved ones who seemed to have disappeared into the community. Again, Cult 101, you gotta isolate. You gotta isolate people so they don't actually talk to other people and realize what they're doing is a little nutty, But nobody could say exactly what happened inside. But we know something was wrong. Because at its height, the Canupi congregation had somewhere between 90 and 100 members, and it operated like a corporation, but a spiritual one, a strict pyramid structural with Osa Valdao at the top. And beneath her sat a tier of elders, pastors who included Fosmo himself, and held enormous authority over ordinary congregates. And every member was organized into teams, each led by a team leader. And members were expected to consult those leaders on all matters of spiritual guidance. But this wasn't framed as a church hierarchy, it was framed as obedience to God. So if you didn't go through your team leader, you weren't just ignoring a rule, you were defying the will of God himself. Former members speaking years later for the HBO docuseries Pray, Obey, Kill, describing the suffocating atmosphere inside. Congregants were required to maintain what they called peace around the bride of Christ. And if that peace was disturbed, if anyone caused friction or disruption, it was taught that this would delay the second coming of Jesus. Those are pretty big stakes, man. Like, if you just talked a little too loud or you interrupted the bride of Christ, she's like, that's it. He's not coming for another 10 years and it's all Jimmy's fault. And Jimmy's like, I didn't know. How convenient for the cult leaders. They just keep pushing it back every time they just get a little bit pissed, just so they can keep the cult going. So the weight of that responsibility naturally kept people silent and compliant. And if silence wasn't enough, there were other methods. And the first was isolation. Members were cut off from family members who questioned the church. So the only people you could turn to, the only community that you had, were people already inside. People who would always steer you right back toward compliance. And the second was spiritual manipulation. Because Valdao and Fosmo used prophecies, visions, and claimed divine communication to steer individual members. These visions would be announced about specific people in the congregation, like messages that told them what to do, where to go, who to be with. But essentially, comply and God's blessing followed, and refuse and his favor would be withheld. Now, Fosmo even claimed that God, I shit you not, was texting him directly on his mobile phone. What carrier is God using? I must know. And Fosmo would forward these messages as divine instructions to the others in the congregation. Because, of course, in reality, Fosmo was writing the messages himself and sending them anonymously to Svensson, a member of the congregation, and claiming them to be divine commands, right? Classic cult leader stuff. So it was just a new kind of manipulation dressed in ancient clothing. And the third method was physical. So for those who didn't fully buy in, that was met with violence. And former members described a punitive culture within the congregation that allegedly included Valdao biting people in the face and also stabbing someone with a fork and slamming members' heads against walls. Did God tell you to do that one too? Did he do that? So the threat of physical consequences was always in the background. And Valdao also reportedly exercised control over members' most private lives, dictating their sexual conduct, sometimes forbidding relationships outright and assigning new ones herself. So this dynamic bled directly into Fosmo's marriage. And while wed to his second wife, Alexandra, he carried on a sexual relationship with multiple women in the congregation, including the family's nanny, Sarah Svensson. So that's the person he's texting me like, oh man, God just told me like, we gotta go in the closet and just like do 7 minutes in heaven. It's weird. I know, like my wife she's like, I guess if God said so, so I guess, see you're there at 3:30 maybe after I'm done eating my chocolate cake from earlier. Like so sick and disgusting. And even later he would have relations with his neighbor's wife, Annetta. And the arrangement with Sarah Svensson was striking in its just brazenness, because she had originally arrived as the family's nanny, but moved into the master bedroom with Fosmo, while Alexandra, his own wife, slept in the guest room. What a dick! And Fosmo justified this by calling it spiritual rather than carnal, because their relationship wasn't adultery, he would say. It was heavenly love, an act of God, something God said. Thumbs up, Fosmo, do what you gotta do, bud. So there were lots and lots of red flags in the beginning, but the affairs weren't even the worst ones, and it would actually be a death. because on December 18th, 1999, Fosmo discovered his first wife, Helena, dead in the bathtub of their home. And investigators found a hole in her skull and a toxic concentration of opioids in her system, but ruled her death an accident. And her husband sold her belongings within days and falsified certain documents tied to her death. But nobody connected those dots at the time. And within months, Fosmo would remarry, and his new wife was Alexandra Bjork, which was Åsa Waldau's younger sister. The one that he eventually kicked out into the guest bedroom because he invited the nanny into the master bedroom. Just a mess. So the two cult leaders were now bound together by family, though, because he was married to Waldau's younger sister. So the congregation processed Helena's death through the lens of their apocalyptic theology. God's kingdom was coming soon, they believed, and Helena had simply been just taken home first, when she clearly was murdered by her husband. But they believed she'd be there just waiting for the rest of them. It was a comforting story that worked and held for a little while. Then came the hammer. So in the early morning of November 8th, 2003, Sarah Svensson crept into Fosmo's home and attacked Alexandra with a hammer while she slept. And Alexandra woke and fought back and managed to call for help. And the assault was never reported to police, and instead, Svensson was quietly sent away from the community to live with her father in southern Sweden, removed like just a problem to be managed. And shortly after, Fosmo and Alexandra flew to Hong Kong for the Bible school that Aid for Nations was running. And from thousands of miles away, Fosmo resumed contact with the banished Svensson through text messages. Messages she believed were being forwarded from God himself. Again, what carrier is he using? I need to know. And one message in particular was calculated and cold, because God, or Fosmo told her, would not show her mercy until she completed what she had started. And he then instructed her to acquire a handgun. No small task in Sweden, by the way, very difficult. And she was told to shoot Alexandra. And she was also told to kill their neighbor, Daniel Lind, whose wife Fosmo had been sleeping with. Just a greedy, disgusting, monster bastard. And Svensson believed every word, because in her mind, she wasn't planning a murder. She was just carrying out a divine command. So on January 10th, 2004, at approximately 4:40 in the morning, Sarah Svensson entered the Fosmo home and walked to the master bedroom where Alexandra lay sleeping. And she would fire 3 shots. And Alexandra Fosmo would die instantly. And Svensson then walked roughly 100 meters to the neighboring home, belonging to 30-year-old Daniel Lind. And he answered the door at her knock, and she aimed and fired, hitting him in the head and chest. And his jaw was also shattered and his teeth were destroyed. And at that point, he was bleeding severely. But against every odd, he managed to call emergency services and he would survive. Oh, your God didn't plan that, did he now? Didn't send you a little text update to be like, you gotta go back and finish the job. Sucks when that doesn't actually work, Sucks when you're actually making it up, But luckily, he survived, and that's when Fosmo, awoke, because he had no idea what was going on, even though he planned the entire thing and told Svensson to murder these 2 people, and he claimed to accompany Daniel Lind into the ambulance to the hospital. And there, he was taken in for questioning shortly after, and his account was almost offensively simple. He just said, I'd been asleep in the other room, and I didn't hear anything. I didn't hear a gun go off. What was that? 5 times. Really heavy sleeper. God's got me on some NyQuil. It's crazy. And the following day, January 11th, Sarah Svensson walked into a police station and she would actually confess to both shootings. Thank goodness. And she guided investigators to the evidence herself, which were shoes in a dumpster and a silencer in a small bag and a gun at the bottom of the lake. And she told them she had acted alone. But fortunately, investigators didn't believe her, because the more insistently she claimed sole responsibility, the more certain they became that someone else was involved, and eventually, they were right. So under questioning, Svensson's account started to crack. and she revealed that she had been receiving anonymous text messages she believed to be divine commands, messages that had been forwarded to her by Helge Fossmo, and the text urged her to kill Alexandra, framing it as mercy, because Alexandra had just lived out her time on Earth and was destined for heaven, so it was a quote-unquote kindness. And Fossmo had encouraged her through Bible passages and up to 44 exchanges of text messages per day. And he had told her that God would not grant her mercy if she failed to act. And investigators recovered erased messages from her phone confirming her account. And Fossmo and Annetta Lind, Daniel's wife, with whom Fossmo had been having an affair with, were both arrested. Karma's a bitch, you monsters. So wiretapping established that Svensson and Fossmo had been lovers, and the manipulation pattern was unmistakable. And forensics moved quickly to build a case, but there was no physical evidence directly tying Fossmo to the scene, no fingerprints and no ballistics, but the digital trail through hundreds of inciting messages, combined with the witness testimony from congregation members about his history of psychological control, was damning. And investigators would luckily reopen the case of Helena Fossmo's death, his first wife. And looking back at evidence with fresh eyes, they determined that her head wound couldn't have been caused by a fall. And worse, the opioids found in her system hadn't been found in her stomach, meaning that the substance hadn't been administered in an invasive way, almost certainly against her will, which it's just so frustrating to think. Like, it's just so blatantly looked over. At least her family knows now and everybody knows now, but what an injustice. Her and Alexandra is just absolutely horrible. But they would see that she had been poisoned. But despite everything that pointed toward foul play, the evidence still wasn't sufficient to secure a conviction against Fossmo for Helena's murder. And Annetta Lind was eventually cleared of involvement in her husband's shooting and released. Investigators also turned their attention to the woman at the very top, Åsa Waldau herself. But her direct involvement in the murders wasn't clear, and prosecutors declined to pursue charges against her. Then, Fossmo said something that stopped investigators in their tracks. Because he wasn't the brains, he claimed. Waldau was. So this was a stunning statement, one that hung in the air without consequence. But with no evidence to act on, prosecutors couldn't really move. Waldau would remain free. The woman who had built the entire ideological scaffolding that made this murder possible walked away from the investigation without so much as a formal charge. So the trial opened in May 2004 and became a national obsession in Sweden. And headlines shifted multiple times a day for months, documenting a story that mixed religious manipulation with sexual control and murder in a way Swedes had never quite encountered before. And Sarah Svensson testified in devastating detail. And she described how Fossmo had worked on her over years, using his religious authority and their sexual relationship as twin levers to bend her will until she had almost none of her own. Saying, quote-unquote, Helge's word was my law, and by the grace of God, I got to be his slave. What? And on July 30th, 2004, both were sentenced. Fossmo would receive life imprisonment for solicitation of murder and attempted murder, but he was acquitted of Helena's death due to insufficient evidence, unfortunately. And Svensson was found guilty of murder, but rather than prison, the court ordered her to receive psychiatric care, acknowledging the profound degree to which she had been psychologically broken down and weaponized by someone she trusted completely. And Fossmo maintained his innocence throughout the trial and pursued every avenue of appeal available to him. But luckily, all were rejected. Where's your God now? And also, I'm not talking about God. I'm talking about his texting God, that guy. I'm talking about himself, basically. And the Pentecostal movement moved swiftly in parallel, expelling the Knutby congregation from its national network in 2004 on the grounds of unorthodox beliefs and revoking its right to officiate marriages. But even with Fossmo behind bars, Knutby didn't collapse overnight, and Waldau continued to lead the congregation, because there was no repercussion for the woman that created this whole shitstorm. Then life inside carried on with unsettling normalcy. And in 2005, she inspired the sect to open a spa and released a CD of church music. I'm gonna go ahead and never listen to that. And in 2007, she published an autobiography titled Without Apparent Irony, Bride of Christ, Whom Can One Trust? And then in August of 2006, Fosmo gave an interview from prison that changed the public record. And he confessed, for the first time, that he had been responsible for Alexandra's murder. And he said he was done living a lie. Quote, "Since I left Canupi, I have gone through a long process. Feelings, thoughts, behavior, my whole self were impregnated by a poisonous sect culture," unquote. And he acknowledged others had been involved in what happened, but he refused to name them. And Sarah Svensson was released from psychiatric care December 2011, with evaluators determining there was no risk of relapse. But the congregation, meanwhile, was slowly hollowing out, losing members year by year as the weight of what happened became impossible to ignore. So by 2016, internal revelations about ongoing sexual exploitation and abuse made continuation untenable. And Valdau departed the congregation, and in 2018, the church dissolved entirely. And 16 years after the murder, Osa Valdau finally faced a courtroom. And she was convicted of 8 counts of assault against former members, slapping, kicking, forcing people into stress positions. And 2 other Canupi leaders were also charged, one for assault and one for sexual exploitation. And Valdau received a suspended sentence and 120 hours of community service. That's it. And for the woman who had built a cult around herself, claimed to be the bride of Jesus, and created the environment in which a murder was engineered, that was the full extent of her punishment. Just, what the hell? The justice system of Sweden, what the hell? And as for Fosmo, he never did serve life. And he was actually released on parole in 2022 after serving 18 years. And both he and Valdau are free today. Largely out of public view, though. So the name Canupi entered the Swedish language as kind of a shorthand, a metaphor for religious extremism, manipulation, and catastrophic consequences of unchecked spiritual authority. And the 2021 HBO docuseries Pray, Obey, Kill brought the case to international audiences, and its impact was significant. And what the Canupi case demonstrated, above everything else, was that charismatic authority, combined with claims of divine communication, is one of the most powerful and dangerous tools a manipulator can wield. Because Fosmo and Valdau didn't need weapons or locked doors to control their congregation, they just used quote-unquote God. And they used isolation, and they used the simple, devastating human desire to belong to something meaningful. So members who thought they were living in holy community were being psychologically dismantled, and when they had no one left to turn to outside the church, the people doing the dismantling were the ones who could tell them whether something was wrong. So Canupi claimed one life and directly damaged dozens of others. So we choose to remember that one life, and I heavily sympathize with the people that were dragged into that horrible cult. But that brings us to our next one, because in a remote corner of Uganda, another cult was building toward a tragedy on a scale that you can't even imagine. A movement that didn't end with a single murder, but with hundreds. So as some of you may know, most attempts to quit vaping or smoking fail for one reason. You try to kill a habit without replacing it. And if you've ever tried to just stop, you know how fast that falls apart. I have plenty of members of my family that have tried to quit smoking and have failed again and again. And it's usually around day 5 when the cravings hit and your hands don't know what to do with themselves. Well, that's exactly why Fume works. Now, Fume is a flavored air device, no nicotine, no batteries, no vapor, and it's a weighted, fidget-friendly tool designed to satisfy that urge to reach for something without giving into old habits. So when a craving shows up, you reach for Fume instead. And it comes in flavors like crisp mint, which is my favorite flavor, and it honestly just kind of feels like a reset button. Not that I've ever had issues with vaping or smoking, but for me, it's honestly just a fidget hand-to-mouth thing, and it just feels refreshing. And Fume has already helped 700,000 people take steps toward better habits, and now it's your turn. So use code CCCM to get a free gift with your journey pack at tryfume.com. That's TRYFUM.com, code CCCM, to claim your free gift today. Thank you so much to Fume for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. So the Knutby case was built around one man and one woman's manipulation of a small, isolated congregation in rural Sweden. But what happened next in the hills of southwestern Uganda operated on an entirely different scale. This wasn't one or two manipulators and 100 followers. This was a machine with 3 engines, each one drawing from a completely different world, and together producing something far more powerful and far more deadly than any of them could have built alone. But understand the movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God, mouthful of a name, by the way, you first need to understand the woman at the heart of it. Credonia Mwerinde was born on July 30th, 1952 in Bugarama village and Tungamo district, Uganda. And she was the daughter of Paolo Kashaku, a retired Roman Catholic catechist, a lay religious teacher, who would prove to be far more significant to the story than his humble description suggests. So Credonia dropped out of school young, and her early adult life was marked by turbulence, because her first husband would pass away, and her second husband would pass away not long after. By the time she married her third husband, Eric Mazima, a wealthy older man who already had taken 6 wives before her, she had outlived 2 marriages and carried the reputation that followed. So the marriage to Mazima was difficult, and Credonia was unable to conceive with him despite having children in her earlier relationships, and she suffered severe convulsions she believed were caused by the spirits of his previous wives. So to contribute to the household, she worked as a barmaid and shopkeeper, running what became known as the Independence Bar in Kanugu. And it was a prestigious establishment, and it was kind of a place that locals associated with and some sources, including some that may trace back to Mwerinde herself, described her as a former Lady of the Night. But that claim is contested by scholars, some of whom believe the Lady of the Night narrative was deliberately constructed to parallel the story of Mary Magdalene, lending Mwerinde a kind of biblical resonance. And don't even get me started on Mary Magdalene, dude. All that stuff about her being a lady of the night and a prostitute, it's all like baloney made up by some Catholic Pope and so we could make a whole video about it. I'll get into it later. Anyway, so whether it was true or fabricated or self-applied, it became part of how the outside world understood her, so it's important to know. And then on August 24th, 1988, something would change, and Mwerinde woke and told Mazima she had received a vision from the Virgin Mary. And Mary, she said, had instructed her to divorce him immediately, and she continued to experience these visions, particularly a cave site called Nyakeshenyi. Sorry if I'm saying these wrong, but it was a place in Uganda associated with the fertility goddess, Nyabingi, and they would slowly transform her into something none of her husbands, her neighbors, or even herself could have anticipated. So, that's our first cog in this engine. Does that make sense? I don't know how engines work, but pretty crazy. She's starting out with some pretty elaborate visions happening right now. You know, what could go wrong? And the second cog or, bracket thing of the movement came from a very different direction. Joseph Kibwetere was born in 1932 in Kishariro in Entugamo district. And unlike Mwerinde, Joseph was a man of standing, educated, well-connected, and genuinely respected. And he actually attended a Catholic secondary school and went on to join St. George's Teacher Training College in Abanda in 1955. And by 1956, he was headmaster at Rushuka Primary School. And by 1959, he had been promoted to assistant supervisor of Catholic schools across the region. And he would marry Kareza Kuribakana in 1960, a woman who later became secretary of the Uganda Land Commission. And together, they would have 8 children. And by 1963, he was one of the most influential men in Catholic education in the country. And he ran for political office in 1980 with the Democratic Party. So on paper, Joseph was exactly the kind of man you'd hold up as an example. Stable, devout, accomplished, but in 1984, he claimed to have begun experiencing visions of the Virgin Mary. Visions, he said, had been communicated to him through Credonia Mwerinde, the woman we talked about previously. And he was actually prone to violent seizures. And around 1998 to 1999, he was actually briefly detained in a psychiatric facility for manic depression. And somewhere in the space between his public life and his private suffering, he had become susceptible to what Mwairinde was selling. So again, what could go wrong? And the third cog, pillar, the ratchet in this engine was the one that lent the entire movement its veneer of intellectual credibility. And that person was Dominic Katari-Babo. And he was a Roman Catholic priest. So he's educated, he's polished, and he's highly regarded. And in the mid-1980s, he traveled to the United States on a scholarship arranged through the Los Angeles Archdiocese, earning a master's degree in religious studies from Loyola Marymount University between 1985 and 1987. And while he studied, he lived at St. Anthony's Parish Rectory in El Segundo, California, where priests who worked alongside him remembered him as pleasant, conscientious, and humble. A man who drove a donated car to get between the parish and the university. What a nice guy. And he would leave the United States on July 10th, 1987. So back in Uganda, Katari-Babo's American education gave him an authority that money couldn't buy. And his friend, then Attorney General Bart Katurebe, described him as a model priest, the last person anyone would expect to fall into something like this. But fall he did, and we will get into that now. So in the early 1990s, Katari-Babo was excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church and joined a movement that ran in direct opposition to everything he had studied and believed. 3 people then, a woman from humble origins who claimed visions from the Virgin Mary, a wealthy, respected politician whose mental health had made him vulnerable, and a priest with an American master's degree whose credentials would attract the educated and devout. And together, they became the engine of one of the deadliest cult massacres in modern African history. But the story of this movement didn't begin with any of those 3, actually. It began decades earlier with a dead girl and a grieving father. Credonia's father, Paulo Kashaku, had lived most of his life as an ordinary Ugandan Catholic catechist. But in 1960, he reported a vision of his deceased daughter, Evangelista, who had died years before. And in his vision, she told him that he would receive messages from heaven, predictions that would come true nearly 30 years later. Similar to the one in Sweden, there's messages from God, a streamline of communication, how handy. But it was in 1988, the same year Credonia claimed her first vision, that Kashaku reported seeing Jesus Christ himself, standing alongside the Virgin Mary and St. Joseph. And they instructed him to use his land near Kanungu as a gathering place for believers. And he listened. So by June of 1989, Kashaku instructed Credonia and his granddaughter Ursula to travel across Uganda spreading the Virgin Mary's message. And during that journey, the 2 women would arrive at the home of Joseph Kibwetere. And Mwairinde told him the Virgin Mary had directed them to seek him out. And Kibwetere was shaken, not because the claim was outlandish, but because it aligned too perfectly with his own experience, because he had seen an apparition of Mary near his home 5 years earlier. So the convergence felt to him like confirmation. So together, Mwairinde and Kibwetere founded the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God in 1989. And its message was urgent and absolute. The world was ending, and only those who strictly obeyed the 10 Commandments would survive. Same as every other cult. World's gonna end, gotta follow everything we say, otherwise you won't go to heaven if the world ends, and you gotta stay away from your family. It's just, it's crazy. It's crazy how it just works in the same cycle, and it works every time, but more often than not, it ends in great tragedy, and we will get to that. But this was a message that resonated in Uganda in ways that it might not have elsewhere, because the country had endured decades of political violence, The AIDS epidemic was devastating communities, and people were living in genuine fear of what tomorrow might bring. So this was a movement that offered certainty, and salvation had fertile soil to grow in. So the movement attracted Catholic priests and nuns who found its theology compelling. And among those who eventually joined was the excommunicated priest Paul Ikazire and Dominic Katari Babo. But Ikazire would later leave and return to the Catholic Church, and in doing so, he revealed something important. Mwerende was the true power in the movement, and Kibwetere was the face, the respectable masculine figurehead who made the cult legible to the outside world. But Mwerende was the architect. Bakashaku would die in 1991, so the group relocated to his land near Kanungu, the very site he had been instructed to offer to God. And by October 1993, local villagers had grown hostile enough to temporarily drive them out, but they would return. And Katari Babo sold 3 of his properties, his car, and his milling machine to fund the growing community. And by the late 1990s, the movement had become a full-on compound surrounded by pineapple and banana plantations, swelling with new members and accumulating significant assets through mandatory donations from those who joined. A tale as old as time. And at its peak, the movement had somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 members. And every one of them had given up everything they had owned to be there. But the stated goal of the movement was simple. Follow the 10 Commandments. Preach the word of Jesus Christ, obey, and be saved. And the methods used to enforce that goal were something else entirely, though. The movement enforced silence as religious discipline. So members were sometimes prohibited from speaking at all and required to communicate only through sign language. And this was framed as a rigorous observance of the 9th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness. But, as we can see from the outside looking in, its practical effect was to sever members from normal conversation, from family, from the ordinary social bonds that might otherwise allow someone to say something isn't right here. So days would pass in total enforced silence, and fasting was institutionalized, and members were permitted only 1 meal a day, Monday through Friday. And they were isolated from outside food sources, and only crops grown on the compound's own lands were permitted. And soap was forbidden as a sinful indulgence, and sexual contact of any kind was prohibited, not as a matter of waiting until marriage, but as a permanent rejection of the flesh. And the movement taught that AIDS was a divine punishment for adultery, and just sex itself was framed as a gateway to damnation. And the most potent tool, as with every cult, it seems, was spiritual manipulation. And Mwerende claimed to receive direct messages from the Virgin Mary through what she described as a hidden telephone system. Not texting this time, because she would actually communicate these messages through everyday objects. Not technically the hand phone like I just demonstrated, but objects like a rock or a piece of wood, if you will. And of course, only she could hear it. But these messages were commands, and commands from the Virgin Mary were not to be questioned. And nightly prayers were led by 12 apostles called the Entumwa, 6 men and 6 women who were preparing the faithful for the second coming of Christ. And the compound was framed as Noah's Ark. Those inside were safe, and the world outside was lost. And members had already surrendered their homes, their land, their cattle, their savings, so there was nowhere left to go. And that was by design. And those who broke the rules faced starvation, hard labor, and physical abuse. And the leaders naturally lived very differently, of course, as they all do, because they would live in a stone house at the top of a hill surrounded by plantations insulated from the deprivations they imposed on everyone else. Very godly of you. And children within the compound fared no better than adults. And they were actually used for child labor and kept in unsanitary conditions, and some were reportedly abducted from outside communities. And Ugandan authorities became aware of some of what was happening, but they wouldn't act. And the movement's apocalyptic beliefs were codified in a roughly 84-page tract called A Timely Message from Heaven, The End of the Present Times, largely written by Katari Babo. And it elevated the leaders as, say it with me, prophets. They always gotta be prophets. And laid out the theology of imminent destruction and served as a recruitment and indoctrination tool. And new members were required to read it multiple times before gaining full membership. And a date was eventually set. The world would end on December 31st, 1999. The year 2000 would be year one of the new world. This was like a widely thought belief. As a Y2K, this was when all the computers were gonna shut down and the world was gonna end and planes were gonna crash. This was like a very common thought among a lot of people. A lot of people thought the world would end, and a lot of churches, a lot of these just predatory churches preyed on these people, like selling, end of the world products, and it was just it was a crazy time. I was pretty young, but I remember the craziness. So as the millennium approached, the compound became increasingly frenzied. And in 1999, a Ugandan newspaper called the New Vision ran an interview with a teenage male member of the movement. And he told the paper that the world was going to end within the year, and that there was no time to waste, and that anyone who wanted to be saved needed to confess their sins immediately. And the interview spread fear and excitement in equal measure. And members who had drifted away were re-enlisting, and people were confessing sins around the clock. And workers abandoned the fields entirely, and new members arrived daily, surrendering their possessions at the gates. But January 1st, 2000 would come and go. And as we know today, nothing really happened, did it now? And the silence that followed was devastating. Members who had sold their land and given away their cattle and severed ties with families who hadn't joined now and had nothing, and the prophecy that justified all of it had simply failed to materialize. And Wairinde and Kibwetere faced something close to revolt, and members stopped making payments, and former members who had surrendered everything demanded it back. And Ugandan police took note of the unrest, and the leader's response was not to collapse. Nay, can't give up now. Double down. Why not? It was to reset. So, not unlike a ton of other cults, a new date was announced. Guys, it's a new date. We got it mixed up. Virgin Mary called me on my water bottle, guys. It's March 17th. March 17th. Yeah, okay, confirm? Might change. Okay, it might change. But as of right now, it's March 17th. And it was March 17th, 2000. New date. And the Virgin Mary herself would return on that date to take the faithful to heaven. But this time would be different because they would have a proper ceremony, a true ascension. The confusion of January was reframed as a test of faith. Those who had doubted needed to recommit, and many of them did, unfortunately. So on March 15th, 2000, Wairinde went shopping. She bought sodas in bulk and delivered invitation letters to members across the region. And on March 16th, the movement held what would prove to be its final gathering, a massive celebration that functioned as a farewell to the world. And 3 bulls were roasted, and around 70 crates of soft drinks were provided, mostly Coca-Cola. And members who had traveled from across Uganda gathered at the Kanungu compound to mark the eve of their ascension. And by all accounts, it resembled a Last Supper. But on the morning of March 17th, 2000, the congregation gathered at the church, a building they called the Ark. And as members poured in, some noticed that the windows and doors had been boarded shut from the outside, nailed closed. And before anyone could fully register what that meant, the building would explode, and a massive fireball tore through the structure. And neighbors heard the blast from a distance and rushed toward the compound to find the church completely destroyed, engulfed in flames. And the bodies of the deceased would be everywhere. And the initial estimates placed the dead at 330 people. But the number would rise. Investigators pieced together what had happened. As 2 days before the fire on March 15th, Katari Babo had visited a shopkeeper named John Musoke in Kasese and purchased approximately 50 liters of sulfuric acid, signing the receipt, Father Dominic, and paying around $167. And he told Musoke the acid was needed to replenish batteries at a remote seminary. And Musoke later recalled being uneasy about the quantity. And police found this receipt at the compound. And the acid, investigators believed, had been used alongside gasoline as an accelerant. And a witness also reported encountering a cult member carrying nails and a hammer toward the compound that same morning. But the fire was not the full extent of what had happened. And 4 days after the blast, as authorities spread across the country to investigate every property the movement had ever occupied, the true scale of the horror began to emerge. And at the Kanungu compound itself, 6 bodies were found sealed inside the latrine. And at the Buhunga compound in Rutoma, near Rukungiri, a site that had served as one of the movement's satellite communities, 153 bodies were unearthed, and 59 of those bodies were children. And at Dominic Katari Babo's estate in Rugazi, Bushenri district, police found 2 separate killing sites, and in the yard and sugarcane field, 74 bodies were exhumed. And inside the house itself, investigators noticed that the floor of one of the bedrooms had been freshly poured with concrete. Katari Babo's nephew told investigators that his uncle had claimed he was digging a pit for an underground refrigerator, and even sold the property to the nephew just 6 days before the fire, for the equivalent of about $3,300. And when prisoners from a nearby jail were brought in to dig through the concrete, they found 81 more bodies packed beneath the floor. And of those 81, 48 were children. And many would have cloths ringed around their necks. So the cause of death was assumed to be strangulation. And others showed signs of stabbing, poisoning, and blunt force trauma. And some bodies had even been partially dissolved in sulfuric acid. And at the farm of a man named Joseph Naimu Rinda in Rushojwa, 81 more bodies were discovered, undressed, packed tightly into a deep pit, and dead for approximately a month. And 44 of those were children. And in Buziga, an affluent suburb of Kampala, 55 more bodies were found in the house of Katari Babo, and they were buried beneath a chicken shed that had been built over the graves as deliberate concealment. So by late March 2000, with preliminary counts from all sites combined, Ugandan police estimated the total dead at around 924. And Vice President Spetsioza Kazibwe said publicly that she believed the true number exceeded 1,000. And for context, the Jonestown Massacre in Guyana in 1978, which I have covered, this is the Jim Jones People's Temple. If you want to go watch that video, I have made that. But until then, the most deadly single cult event in modern history had killed 918 people. So if the 924 estimate was accurate, the Kanungu massacre had surpassed it. And when forensic pathologists completed their formal examination months later, the confirmed count was revised to 780. The lower number reflecting the limits of what investigators could formally document given the scale and condition of the remains. So the 924 figure remained the most widely cited, though, but it was always just an estimate, and the investigation that produced it was deeply imperfect. But what nobody disputed was this: the bodies showed clear evidence of murder. People had been killed weeks or months before the fire, and some had been dead for years. So this was an organized extermination of anyone who had become a liability. Those who had demanded their money back, those who had questioned the failed December prophecies, those who had simply seen too much. And the leaders were nowhere to be found, and not one of them had been inside the church when it burned. So Ugandan authorities moved quickly in the immediate aftermath, deploying investigators to every compound associated with the movement before evidence could be destroyed. But the resources available to them were catastrophically inadequate for what they found, because there were no body bags. Investigators had only surgical gloves, and some covered their faces with cypress leaves because the smell was unbearable. And the bodies were examined for only a few minutes each before being reburied in trenches. And mass graves were missed entirely. And forensic work was rushed and, in some cases, corrupt. And the official numbers that emerged from this process were estimates as much as counts. But the central question was, where were the leaders? And investigators were initially stumped. And the forensic team and police had initially assumed that Kibwetere, Mwerinde, and the others had been inside the church when it burned. And a witness in Kanungu changed that assumption, because they reported seeing both Kibwetere and Mwerinde leaving the celebration in the early hours of March 17th with packed suitcases. And in April of 2000, Ugandan authorities issued international arrest warrants for 6 individuals. Kibwetere, Mwerinde, Katari Babo, Publicity Secretary Joseph Kasapureri, Treasurer John Kamagara, and Ursula Komunhongi. And they faced 10 counts of murder each. That's it, with the death penalty attached, though. So there is that. And a reward was offered for information, but not one of them was ever found. So the pursuit of justice for what happened in Kanungu was, from the beginning, undermined by institutional failure at every single level. And 9 months after the massacre in December of 2000, Uganda's International Affairs Minister, Moses Ali, announced the creation of a commission of inquiry. And it would be responsible for defining what constituted a cult, reconstructing the events at Kanungu, and identifying the perpetrators. And it had 6 months to complete its work. And the commission never held a single meeting, though. And it had no money, no offices, and no facilities. So it ceased to exist before it even began, basically. And the Uganda Human Rights Commission published a report in May 2002, a document that did what the abandoned commission could not, laying out clearly what had happened, arguing unambiguously that this was a mass murder, and making recommendations to the government about how to prevent something like this from happening again. But the government did not act on those recommendations. And the criminal investigation was formally closed 10 years after the massacre. And 20 years after, no arrest has been made, no prosecution has begun, and none of the 6 named leaders has been located, charged, or held in any way accountable. So the commission that was supposed to provide answers produced nothing. And the government that was supposed to act did not. And it was, by every measure, a complete collapse of justice. And a failure made worse by the fact that the warning signs had existed for years before the fire. Local officials had been aware of child labor, and complaints had been filed. And the cult had even been temporarily expelled from its compound by villagers in 1993. So every intervention stopped short of anything that might have mattered. And for the survivors, the aftermath was compounded devastation. And the members who had been away from the compound on March 17th, or who had somehow escaped the violence of the preceding months, returned to find their families gone and their former lives completely erased. Everything they had owned, land, home, cattle, savings, had been surrendered as a condition of membership. And the cult had taken it all, not to mention a lot of people's family members and friends. And there was nothing to go back to and nowhere to go. So many were trapped by survivor's guilt so severe it was incapacitating, because some had brought their entire families into the movement, and some of those families were now in mass graves. And the government declared April 2nd, 2000 a national interdenominational prayer day. Great, that's exactly what they needed. Just a day. How about some investigation, arrests, justice, anything? It's just a joke. It's disgusting to think of all these people that were just treated like nothing. And the highest authority also treated them like nothing. It is devastating because there was no justice, obviously, but there was no housing assistance, no financial support, no psychological services. The prisoners who had been conscripted to dig up the concrete at Qatari Babo's estate, forced to pull 81 children's bodies from beneath a bedroom floor, were given no support either, of course. And the local Catholic Church, embarrassed by the degree to which the movement had drawn from its own clergy and membership, initially made it difficult for survivors to return to the faith, which is disgusting. And the community around Kanungu was left to process an atrocity without the tools or resources to do so. And an attempt was reportedly made by at least one person to revive the movement, but it came to nothing, luckily. But the Kanungu massacre stands as one of the deadliest cult events in recorded history, with an estimated 924 dead across multiple sites. And what made the movement so effective and so lethal was the specific combination of conditions it exploited. Uganda in the late 1980s and 1990s was a country shaped by fear. And there was a movement that offered certainty, that named the fear and gave it a divine cause and promised a way through, and arrived at exactly the right moment to recruit at scale. And the three leaders each served a distinct function in making the movement credible as we know. And I pray karma has gotten to all of them, or God, whichever one came first. But they all deserve a special seat in hell. But to this day, no one connected with the leadership of the movement for the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God has seen the inside of a prison. And there is no memorial at the site of Kanungu. And there are no graves marked with names. There is quite literally only the long, quiet weight of what happened. A weight that survivors and the families of the dead have carried alone. So my heart goes out to every single one of those people. It's just, it's hard to even fathom or understand how that could be going on just somewhere around the globe. So, and the fact that I've never even heard about this until I researched it. It's one of the most devastating cases I've ever read, and it is, nobody knows about it. So that is why I wanted to cover it today.
You know what sucks? Rent, mortgage payments, just anything where you need to give up your hard-earned money, basically.
But I'm going to tell you about something that actually makes it sting a little less, and that's Built. Now, Built is the loyalty program for renters that rewards you for your biggest monthly expense, rent, because every rent payment earns you Built points that you can redeem toward flights, hotels, Lyft rides, Amazon purchases, fitness classes, and so much more. And here's the part that is genuinely exciting. Built members can now earn points on mortgage payments too. And that means whether you're renting or you've made the jump to owning, you're getting something back, which is really nice. I personally love getting something back for paying my mortgage. I feel like I deserve it. And I know you do too. And plus, you unlock exclusive benefits from more than 45,000 restaurants, fitness studios, pharmacies, and neighborhood partners. And personally, I've been putting my points toward restaurants and travel. Caleb and I don't get out much, so that's what we're building it up for, to eventually go somewhere, but we haven't yet, but we will eventually. So join the loyalty program for renters at joinbuilt.com/CCCM. That's JONBILT.com/CCCM. Make sure to use my link so they know I sent you. Thank you so much to Built for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. But this next cult was different in almost every way that didn't matter, and identical in every way that did. This cult operated in the open in Venice Beach, Los Angeles. It had a website, a streaming platform, a clothing line, and a record label, and a foundation. And its leader gave lectures at Harvard Divinity School, and celebrities attended its classes and posted about it on Instagram. And it looked, from the outside, like exactly what it claimed to be: a modern wellness studio run by a charismatic, spiritual entrepreneur. But, newsflash, it wasn't. Katie Ann Griggs was born on August 30th, 1979 on a farm in Fort Collins, Colorado. And her mother, Nancy Ann Steinhorn Galloway, was a farmer, a movement therapist, and by some accounts, a physical comedy performer, or a therapeutic clown, if you will, which I can't help but just think of Robin Williams when he acts like a clown in the hospital. Why can't I remember that movie name? But essentially that. But her father would leave the family when Katie was a year old, and she was raised largely by her mother and her stepfather, a man who went by Rabbit Galway, his legal name, and her brother. And Katie grew up steeped in New Age spirituality. The idea of aligning your body, mind, and soul, of tuning your chakra, as the practice framed it, was not something she encountered as a teenager and decided to explore. It was the water she swam in from childhood, and one family story captures it perfectly. At around 7 or 8 years old, she gathered her family around the dinner table and made them stare at a candle flame in silence. And whether it was meditation or performance or both, it was the same impulse that would define the rest of her life, because she wanted people's attention. Not unlike a lot of other people in Los Angeles, but this is significantly worse. She just wanted to be the one in the center. And her friends from childhood remembered her that way, focused on the spotlight, on being adored, and on becoming famous. And she was a theater kid, a performer, someone who understood instinctively how presence worked. And after high school, Katie enrolled at City University in New York in the early 2000s, where she was introduced to Ashtanga yoga. But college would bring something else too, something awful, and that is S. And that trauma would pretty much destabilize everything. And she would stop attending classes properly, started going to parties, and used drugs to manage what she was carrying. And eventually, she would drop out. But she would rebuild slowly, and she would return to college, but this time completing a bachelor's degree in liberal arts at Antioch College in Ohio, studying English, poetry, and humanities. And she experimented with different names during this period. Athena Day, Katie Day, Kundalini Katie, each one kind of a reinvention, a way of shedding one's skin and stepping into another. And it was shortly after September 11th, 2001, while working in a fashion showroom in New York, that she walked into a Kundalini yoga class for the first time. And within minutes, she felt something she later described as a surge of energy traveling up her spine and out through the top of her head. And it was the feeling, she said, that she had been looking for her entire life. So the stage had been found, and the performance would follow. So Katie's entry into Kundalini yoga was an introduction to a world that would prove to have a much darker architecture than it appeared. Because Kundalini yoga, as it was practiced in the West, had been introduced by a man named Harbhajan Singh Kalsaborn, known publicly as Yogi Bhajan, who traveled from India to Toronto, Canada to Los Angeles in 1968. A former customs inspector, he became the face of Kundalini yoga in America and established the 3HO Foundation, Healthy, Happy, and Holy. And the timing was perfect, because the late 1960s were full of disillusioned young Americans looking for spiritual direction. And Bhajan was charismatic, authoritative, and strategically brilliant. And he built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, counting presidents, popes, and the Dalai Lama among his connections. And he founded Yogi Tea, and he established Akal Security, and he was, by every visible measure, a beloved and respected spiritual figure. But what was happening beneath that surface would not become fully known for decades. And after Katie's first class in 2001, she committed to the practice completely. And she visited Bhajan ashrams and took part in the 3-day White Tantric Yoga Marathon. And in 2002, she met Bhajan face to face, an encounter she described as transformative. And she then came under the mentorship of a man named Harijiwan Khalsa, a longtime Bhajan disciple, whose real name was Stephen Oxenhandler. Little bit different, but Harijiwan had served 18 months in federal prison following a 24-month conviction for his role in a telemarketing fraud scheme, which involved fraudulent toner cartridge invoicing. Whatever that is, dude. And when he was released, he was a felon in his 40s with limited options, and he had found his footing within the Kundalini yoga community. And he recognized something in Katie: charm, stage presence, and beauty. The ability to hold a room. So he saw her as a vehicle for what the Kundalini yoga world badly needed. A modern rebrand, a younger face, someone who could carry the legacy forward into a world that had moved on from aging spiritual teachers. and he became her mentor in the truest sense, shaping her practice and her persona. And Katie completed her Kundalini yoga teacher certification in 2004, the same year Yogi Bhajan died. And before his death, Bhajan had reportedly given her the spiritual name Guru Jagat, meaning bringer of light to the universe. That's not going to help with her ego. And she claimed this herself, though the claim was disputed. But what is clear is that she began using the name publicly in 2012, and that by the time she fully embraced it, it had become more than a name. It was a brand, a costume, and a throne all at once. So for years before the studio opened, she built her base slowly, teaching classes from her living room, running a website, cultivating a following through proximity and personality. And then in 2013, the pieces came together. And together with Hari Jiwan, she founded the Rama Institute for Applied Yogic Science and Technology in Venice, Los Angeles. That sounds like a lot of bullshit. But she was now officially Guru Jagat. And the Institute was framed as a place of transformation, somewhere you could go to become wealthy, empowered, beautiful, and enlightened. And the promise, in other words, was literally everything. And in the wellness culture of Los Angeles in 2013, that promise found a ready market. It would today, honestly. And within months, celebrities were attending. Demi Moore, Alicia Keys, Kate Hudson, Russell Brand. That one's not as surprising. And by 2014, the Institute was successful enough to open a second location in Boulder, Colorado. So every morning from 8:30 onwards, a parade of predominantly white women made their way into the Venice studio, and reishi cappuccinos from the nearby organic grocery Erewhon in hand. And they were required to wear all white with head wraps or turbans, and hypnotic mantras by White Sun, a Grammy-winning band founded by Hari Jiwan, poured from the speakers. And rainbow prayer flags hung above sheepskin rugs where followers sat and waited. And glittery crystals, sacred ornaments, altar offerings, and the photographs of Yogi Bhajan that decorated the walls. And at the front of it all, on a stage surrounded by crystals and plants and a gong built for the rock band Van Halen, which is pretty cool, I'm not gonna lie, sat Guru Jagat. The whole thing was staged with extraordinary precision, designed to be visually overwhelming, to feel exclusive, and to photograph well, of course, because you can't be in Los Angeles, and what you do doesn't matter unless you post it, okay? Because Rama, in the language of the era, was extremely Instagrammable. And people came partly because they wanted to belong to something that others would be jealous of. A tale as old as time. And that desire was baked into the experience from the beginning. And Guru Jagat preached that there was nothing spiritually incompatible between enlightenment and wealth, and that Kundalini yoga could help you achieve both. And she described herself as a serial entrepreneur. And she wore white robes and large earrings and projected the image of spiritual leader who was also a fashion icon. Slay. I'm just kidding. And the practice involved repetitive physical movements, chanting, breathing, and mantra with early morning sessions. And sometimes starting between 3 and 4 in the morning. I'm out. I wouldn't get caught in this cult. That's way too early for me. I'm out. Won't be there. But described by regular attendees as physically addictive, producing states of euphoria. But behind the aesthetic and the celebrity validation, the structure was familiar. And staff at Rama were required to demonstrate full devotion to the Institute and to Guru Jagat personally. And many were classified as independent contractors to sidestep labor protections. And they worked around the clock, updating her social media, managing her schedule, uploading classes, coordinating events, and were either unpaid or paid well below minimum wage. And when Guru Jagat temper ignited, which former employees described as happening with explosive unpredictability, there was nowhere to go. And she reportedly called staff at 3 in the morning with irrational demands. So the environment was one of control maintained through fear. Sound familiar? And with total devotion as the only safe posture. So while Guru Jagat was the public face, Hari Jiwan was running the operation from the wings. And all significant decisions went through him first. And he was, in the structure that former staff later described, the actual boss. And Guru Jagat was both his instrument and his product. And the final architecture of Rama was built on tiered extraction, an online membership to the Aquarian Women's Leadership Society costing around $727 a year. What the f? And in-person courses ran to $1,500, and retreat packages started at $2,000, and teacher training programs cost $3,500. And Guru Jagat position was that spiritual peace was expensive, that spending money on your development was itself a form of devotion. Duh. And the money, she said, didn't go to her. No. Given the lavish lifestyle she maintained, former employees found that claim a little unconvincing, but the institute would just keep expanding. And a third location opened in New York City in 2017 at 125th Stanton Street on the Lower East Side. A converted gravestone shop converted into an alleged women-owned yoga studio. And a fourth opened in Mallorca, Spain. And Rama TV launched as a subscription streaming platform, and a record label followed. And a clothing brand called Guru Jagat Collection, and a lifestyle brand called Robotic Disaster, which that one fits. And a book, Invincible Living, The Power of Yoga, The Energy of Breath, and Other Radiant Tools for a Radiant Life, reportedly published in English, French, and German, and lectures at Harvard Divinity School, and she taught yoga at Bonnaroo, and a podcast, Reality Riffing with Guru Jagat, that eventually reached listeners in over 50 countries. And she also established the Rama Foundation in 2016, a nonprofit offering scholarships to underrepresented communities and donation-based space in South Los Angeles, which just completed their picture, you know? A spiritual empire with a philanthropic wing, and a guru who was also a brand. But Katie Griggs had wanted to be famous since she was a child, and by every external measure, she had succeeded. And for years, the cracks were internal, contained with the walls of the studio, absorbed by the staff who had nowhere else to go. And former employees and students had been quietly accumulating stories of abuse and manipulation for as long as Rama had existed. The explosive temper, the 3 a.m. demands, the culture of fear, but these accounts circulated only among former members, people who had left and trying to understand what had happened to them. But from the outside, Rama still looked like what it had always appeared to be. But then, in December of 2019, the architecture began to crack from the outside. And Pamela Sahara Dyson, Yogi Bhajan, former personal secretary and one of his most senior administrators, published a memoir called Premka, White Bird in a Golden Cage. And the book was a bombshell by all accounts. And Dyson described in precise and devastating detail how Bhajan had coerced her and other staff members into sexual relationships, exerting control over their lives through spiritual manipulation, using the language of devotion and divine will to justify and abuse. And she wrote about the forced sexual relationship that resulted in a pregnancy, and about Bhajan ordering her to have an abortion. And the book opened a door that had been locked for decades, and dozens of other women walked through it with their own accounts. So by March 2020, the Siri Singh Sahib Corporation, with organization that managed Bhajan's legacy, had commissioned a private investigation by a neutral third party called an olive branch. And nearly 300 witnesses participated. And the report, published in August 2020, was unsparing. And it concluded that Bhajan had almost certainly 3 women, caused physical injury to 8 others during sexual encounters, and engaged in non-consensual touching of 9 more, and also shown inappropriate images to minors, and directed women to engage inappropriate acts with each other in front of him, and or with him. Just a disgusting pervert. But the investigators estimated he had abused approximately 100 women over the course of decades. So his wildly promoted celibacy was a fabrication. Shocking. And his spiritual authority had been used as a weapon. Shocking. And the report also identified financial exploitation, drug smuggling, money laundering, and systemic abuse of children in 3HO boarding schools in India. So the Kundalini yoga world split immediately. Studios canceled Kundalini programming entirely, and teachers publicly denounced Bhajan. And the community that had built itself around his teachings faced an existential reckoning. And Guru Jagat watched all of this and made her choice. She took to social media to defend Yogi Bhajan. When pressed on the allegations by followers, by journalists, by people who wanted to understand where she stood, she framed him as a historical figure whose complexity needed to be understood in context. Oh! What, bitch? The way one might understand a founding father. And she told Vanity Fair she wasn't going to spend her days trying to figure out whether someone like George Washington had done things she'd disagree with today. Your ignorance is stupid. I hate you. And Bhajan's image stayed on the walls of every Rama studio, and his teachings remained central to the curriculum, and the institute didn't budge. And Hari Jiwan's response was, if anything, a lot worse. And in February of 2020, he posted a 52-minute video suggesting that Dyson had fabricated her account for financial gain. Oh, great. Victim blaming. Awesome. And he dismissed every allegation and defended Bhajan completely. And former 3HO members and Sikh activists who spent years trying to bring Bhajan's abuses to light were furious, naturally. And for them, Rama's refusal to distance itself from Bhajan was not just a failure of leadership, it was an active choice to protect a system of abuse. And the public backlash intensified, rightfully so. And then came the pandemic. And with it, something began to slip in Guru Jagat herself. She refused to comply with California's public health guidelines, and she declined to promote vaccines. And her podcast became a vehicle for increasingly erratic content, like claims that COVID-19 was caused by chemtrails, that artificial intelligence was a tool of control, that global conspiracy was operating beneath the surface of daily life, which, I don't know about all of those, but maybe she had some points in there somewhere, but I don't like her anyway, so she's just stupid. And she amplified QAnon content, she discussed Pizzagate, she invited Holocaust denier David Icke and her conspiracy theorist author Furstenberg onto the podcast as guests. Just going full conspiracy mode, right? But again, the whole Pizzagate thing, well, that was true, seeming like. Again, I'm not justifying anything she's doing or whatever, but it's incredibly ironic how she's saying all of this stuff about Pizzagate and all this, like, government and all this stuff, when she is involved in the same thing and she's still praising a person that was involved in similar things. It's just the most hypocritical. She's so hypocritical. It's infuriating. And the audience that had followed her was not uniformly prepared for this turn, and enrollment began to drop. And the celebrities who had once been photographed at Rama events grew quiet, and revenue declined. And in October of 2020, Guru Jagat was scheduled to appear at Alicia Keys' Soul Care Lounge, a high-profile wellness event that would have restored some of her visibility to a mainstream audience. But Sikh activists organized and protested her inclusions, and Keys removed her from the panel. So it was just a public signal that the culture around her had shifted, and the platform she had built was no longer usable. Now, there was no police investigation into Rama, no arrests, no charges. What accountability existed was informal and more community-driven than anything. And in July of 2020, an Instagram account called Rama Wrong appeared and operated by former Rama employees Nicole Norton and Becky Lavelle. And the account became a gathering point, a place where former employees and students could share what had happened to them and find others who understood. And stories accumulated really quickly, and accounts of unpaid wages, psychological manipulation, the creation of culture where any questioning of Guru Jagat was framed as a spiritual failing. And the wellness community that had once celebrated Rama began to look at it very differently. And journalists started paying attention, and enrollment continued to drop, and revenue did too. So the empire that had taken a decade to build began to visibly deteriorate. And then in July of 2021, Guru Jagat broke her ankle while on a work tour in Germany. She declined treatment there and flew back to Los Angeles for surgery. And her mother later recalled the phone call she received from Europe, with her daughter scared, in pain, asking to come home. And the surgery went ahead in Los Angeles. Shortly after, a pulmonary embolism developed, which was a blood clot that traveled to her lungs. And on August 1st, 2021, at 9:07 p.m. Pacific time, Katie Griggs went into cardiac arrest, and she was only 41 years old at the time, and she would pass away. So there was no trial, no criminal charges were ever filed, no sentencing to follow. Guru Jagat died before any formal investigation could ever be launched. Not that one was particularly imminent. But the abuses at Ramah were real, but they were the kind that falls between the cracks of legal accountability, like wage theft and labor violations that are difficult to prosecute, and emotional abuse in spiritual context that is harder still. And staff had signed contracts classifying them as independent contractors, so civil suits were theoretically available, but the state they would have been filed against had almost nothing in it. And Guru Jagat's net worth at death was an estimated around $500,000, and family and former employees described her as effectively broke or in debt, with a money trail unclear. So she would be buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, and Harijan Khalsa, the man who had shaped her from the beginning, who had run the operation from the sidelines, who had publicly defended a serial abuser and built a system of exploitation alongside her, disappeared from public view entirely. His fate remains unknown, but he had never been held accountable for anything. And the celebrities who attended Ramah, been photographed at Ramah, and lent their names to Ramah's credibility, quietly just moved on. What's accountability for celebrities, right? And most said nothing publicly, and some distanced themselves with a word or two, but none of them faced any consequences for having normalized the institution with their presence. And the victims were left with their trauma and their unpaid wages and their lost years. Now, without Guru Jagat, Ramah had no center. The entire structure had been built around her personality and her presence, and without her, it began to dissolve almost immediately. And the Venice flagship closed, and the Boulder location closed, and the New York City studio closed, and the Mallorca space would close. And Ramah TV went dark, and reality riffing with Guru Jagat stopped uploading, and the clothing brand, the lifestyle brand, and the record label all vanished. And the Ramah Foundation, the nonprofit, the scholarship programs, the donation space in South Los Angeles dissolved, and former students were left to navigate the wreckage in whatever way they could. And some continued practicing Kundalini yoga independently, separating the practice from the institution, and others abandoned it entirely, too damaged by the association to return. And a community of former members formed around shared processing, in therapy groups, online spaces, the continued work of at Ramah Wrong, and former employees described symptoms consistent with PTSD, nightmares, anxiety, difficulty trusting others, and some were consumed by guilt for having participated, for having recruited others, and for having defended the institution when it was still running. And some were just angry and had no one to direct that anger toward. The person responsible was dead. Both of them were dead. And the man behind the curtain had just fully disappeared, and the legal system had never engaged. So there was nowhere for the feeling to go. But the story of Guru Jagat and Ramah has been extensively documented in the years since her death, including in the documentary Breath of Fire. It became, in the language of wellness community that once embraced it, a cautionary tale. But what it's a cautionary tale about is worth being precise. Ramah was not a fringe operation. It was not hidden in a compound or an isolated rural community. It operated in the most visible corner of America wellness culture, validated by celebrity attendance and press coverage, and nonprofit with a social justice mission. The exploitation that ran through it, the wage theft, the psychological abuse, the cult of personality built around a single charismatic figure, was all conducted in plain sight, dressed in weird white linen outfits and accompanied by Grammy-winning music for some reason. But the whole aesthetic was just a trap, because when everything looks clean and aspirational and expensive, and when the people around you are celebrities and the studio is on Instagram and the guru is on a podcast with hundreds of thousands of listeners, it becomes very difficult to say, this is a cult. This is exploitation. Something is wrong here. And the trappings of legitimacy were so carefully constructed that questioning them felt like a personal failing, a sign that you weren't spiritually developed enough to understand what was being asked of you, if that makes sense. And the defense of Yogi Bhajan in that context was not incidental. It was very revealing. When Pamela Dyson's memoir forced every Kundalini teacher in America to choose a side, Guru Jagat's choice told her followers exactly what her loyalty structure looked like. And a significant number of them remained anyway. Because by that point, the investment was too deep, and the community was too real, and the alternative, which was accepting that something they had trusted had been built on exploitation, was too painful. So the dynamic with the psychological difficulty of leaving something you've sacrificed for is the same in every cult, from the Swedish village to the Ugandan compound to a yoga studio in Venice Beach. The specific details change, and the aesthetic changes, and the scale changes, but the mechanisms don't. And as long as people are searching for meaning, there will be someone ready to exploit that search. So please be careful out there. But that is that for this deep dive on 3 different cults, maybe ones you've never heard of. I genuinely have never heard of any of these until somebody brought them up in the comments, so please let me know other subjects or cults or people you want me to deep dive into, and I will do that. But until then, I will see your beautiful face, and please stay safe out there, okay? Bye. It was still dark when she left the house. A 15-year-old girl alone on a bicycle, pedaling toward a job that started before sunrise. But she would never make it there, and the case would sit unsolved for the better part of 2 decades. And in the end, it wasn't a detective who cracked it, not new evidence, and not a stroke of luck, and not a deathbed confession. It was a lie. This is the story of Nicole van den Hurk. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Today we are talking about a absolutely heartbreaking case, but also an incredible breakthrough that was made. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 to the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through the windshield into this case together. Let's take a quick pause to talk about something I have been absolutely loving lately, and that is Jones Road. And before Jones Road, getting ready took forever and always ended up looking heavy and kind of caked on. But now I am obsessed with the Miracle Balm. It just feels so nice and looks so nice, and it actually enhances my skin instead of just masking it. And it's the ultimate multitasker. It's highlighter, bronzer, blush, lip tint. I get that effortless, glowy look in under 60 seconds. Perfect for summer, post-workout, or travel when I don't want to pack a whole makeup bag. And I don't. Newsflash, I don't, because nobody's got time for that. At least I don't have time for that. And the best part is that every formula is packed with skin-loving ingredients, clean and high-performing with no phthalates, sulfates, or BPA. And they just launched a new foundation stick that even skeptics will love. And I'm a skeptic. I'm not much of a foundation person, but it is so nice because it's skincare forward, buildable medium to full coverage that feels weightless with ceramide, squalene, and sodium hyaluronate. Not to mention, it's dermatologist tested and comes in 30 shades and never looks cakey. And for a limited time, our listeners get a free gift on their first purchase with code KMK at checkout. Just head to jonesroadbeauty.com and use code KMK. And after you purchase, they'll ask where you heard about them, and please let them know that I sent you. I absolutely love this brand so much, so I'm really excited to be working with them. So please go check them out and use code KMK. Thank you so much to Jones Road Beauty for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. Now, Nicole was born on July 4th, 1980, in the small German city of Erkenletz, but her birth name was Nicole Tetmeyer, and her mother, Angelica, was raising Nicole on her own when she met a Dutchman named Ad van den Hurk, and the two fell in love. Now, Nicole was 3 when the whole family crossed over into the Netherlands, and her biological father remained behind in Germany. And after Ad and Angelica's wedding, Tetmeyer became van den Hurk, and Nicole would get that last name as well. So she had a new country, a new family, and a new life taking shape around her. But Angelica struggled with her mental health. And she'd disappear into her bedroom for hours at a time, withdrawn and unreachable. And for a young girl trying to build a bond with her mother, that distance became the defining feature of their entire relationship. And in 1989, when Nicole was 8 years old, Ad and Angelica would unfortunately divorce. And Ad was granted custody and became the one actually raising Nicole. Now, Ad's career was in music, and the hours of that job are really long, and single parenting on top of all that was pretty brutal. And his mother lived just a few minutes away though, and he leaned on her pretty heavily to help out with Nicole. Now the grandmother became something more than a babysitter, and Nicole and her stepbrother Andy, who was 5 years old, would stay overnight and spend whole days under her roof in Tongelra. Apologies if I say any of these words wrong, I am doing my best. And this was one of Eindhoven's neighborhoods. And over time, the bond between the kids and their grandmother deepened immensely because it felt safe, and that house became Nicole's anchor. And then Ad started seeing someone, a woman named Yolanda, and she worked in music as well. And she got along with Andy and Nicole, and eventually she and Ad would marry. But the problem was that both of them were gone for work all of the time. So the grandmother picked up even more of the load. And then in April of 1995, Angelica, Nicole's biological mother, would pass away in Tilburg. And the exact circumstances of her death were never fully clarified. But there is a report that does say she passed away by way of her. And Nicole was naturally devastated because she'd spent years separated from her mother by illness and by the custody agreement, and now the distance became permanent. And the relationship she wanted with her mother was never going to happen now. And by the fall of 1995, Nicole was 15, and she'd settled into her grandmother's place along with Andy. Now, as she grew older, Nicole didn't really spend as much time in the house anymore. And if she wasn't at school, she was at work or out with friends. And she had a tight circle around her, people who kept her busy and kept her distracted from everything her family had gone through. And she also had a boyfriend at the time and was just a girl building a life outward, moving fast, filling the space with connection wherever she could find it. And then, one day, Nicole told her aunt something unsettling, and she complained that some man she had never seen before followed her and harassed her while she was walking home. But unfortunately, nothing would be done about it at the time. Now, it was still dark out when Nicole left her grandmother's house on the morning of Friday, October 6, 1995. And shortly after 5 a.m., Nicole got on her bicycle and headed toward Woensel Shopping Center in Eindhoven, because she had a temporary job there at the supermarket, specifically a holiday position that required really early starts. And it was her regular commute, the same route she always took. But Nicole never made it to work. And when she didn't show up for her shift, her coworkers grew really concerned. And a late arrival turned into a missed shift. And a missed shift turned into a phone call. And police were contacted. And the first searches would begin immediately. And that evening at 6 o'clock, officers pulled Nicole's bicycle from the Dommel River. Now the Dommel winds through the Eindhoven area, cutting across the area she would have ridden through that very morning. And the bike was completely submerged, and the search would widen very fast. So police would zero in on every single bridge, water's edges, cycling paths, and walkways anywhere close to where the bicycle had turned up. And the river became the anchor point. And for 11 straight days, October 6th to October 17th, search teams tore through the Dommel and the surrounding forest. And teams worked the water and the banks grid by grid. And shortly after Nicole vanished, a TV program called Deadline launched a massive coordinated search of its own. And they brought in search teams and dogs. And much of the focus centered on a location called the Vosvenpot area, which was repeatedly mentioned in coverage, but they would find nothing. But on October 19th, another piece of Nicole surfaced, and her small backpack was discovered on a strip of ground between the DAF complex and Canal near a canal in Eindhoven. Now the backpack would change the map. because the bicycle was in one part of the city and the backpack was in another, and that kind of spread doesn't happen by accident. So on October 20th, officers went through the canal and worked the southern banks, and they came back again on October 28th and the 29th, and some people wondered whether Nicole had simply just run away. And as we know, her biological father still lived in Germany, and she had extended family there, and perhaps she went to go stay a while with them over there. But her stepfather would completely shut down that theory, and he would say Nicole hadn't fled anywhere, and this was much worse. And the tip count for the search hit roughly 300 by November 20th. So that was 300 leads from the public, and not one of them pointed to a clear suspect. And her bike and backpack had been found, but Nicole herself had not. So on Wednesday, November 22nd, 1995, a passerby walking through a stretch of woodland between Mierlo and Lierup stumbled onto something hidden beneath a pile of branches and pruning waste, and it would be Nicole. Roughly 7 weeks after she vanished, her body lay roughly 10 kilometers east of her grandmother's house, separate from where both her belongings had been found, in the woodland area of North Brabant, deliberately concealed. Because it was obvious that someone had taken the time to cover her. With the location and the effort to hide her and the distance from the searched zones, all of it pointed to a killer who chose carefully. And Nicole's body had been exposed to the elements throughout that time, 7 weeks. So rain, bacteria, insects, temperature shifts, just weeks of decomposition working against everything forensic science needed. And they would collect as many biological samples as they could, with clothing traces, hair evidence, and 3 DNA samples were gathered in total, 2 from her genital area and 1 from the fabric of her underwear. Now, the techniques available in 1995 were, of course, limited by modern standards, and combined with the outdoor decay, those samples were considered very fragile at best, and contamination was a real possibility. But investigators preserved them anyway, and the autopsy would tell the rest. And it would say that Nicole had been killed through extreme violence, with the cause of death being internal bleeding from a stab wound, and her jaw was also fractured, and she had injuries to her head and to her fingers. And the finger injuries suggested she fought back. And unfortunately, there was also evidence of acid. But investigators made the deliberate choice to keep that finding from the public, and the acid was documented internally and noted in the case file. And on November 28, 1995, Nicole was buried. But before the body was even found, one moment stood out in the search. And on October 24th, 1995, an anonymous man called police, and he said he could identify Nicole's killer, and then the line just went dead. And the call cut off before officers could get a full statement, and before they could pin down a name or a location. But they had a recording to go off of. So come January 1996, that recording was broadcast on national television in hopes that someone would recognize the voice, or the caller himself would come forward again. But sadly, neither happened. But then, in February of 1996, a different lead surfaced, and a friend of the Vandenhurks family was arrested on drug trafficking charges. And while locked up, this person pointed the finger at specific men. And the claim was that those men had forced the drug smuggling on them, and that they were also behind Nicole's murder. And Ad initially believed the story, Nicole's stepfather, because to him it finally felt like a break, a thread that might actually lead somewhere. So police investigated. So they pulled the claim apart, but the story fell apart under their scrutiny. So it was just another dead end. And by now, the pattern was the same. Tips would come in, the leads were chased, but nothing stuck. And one magazine even put up a cash reward, asking the public for anything they could help identify the killer. And naturally, more tips would follow, but none proved strong enough for a prosecution. And eventually, the investigative team shrank and new investigators took over. But Nicole's file did not close. But it did kind of stop moving, and the case settled into a kind of limbo that families of murder victims know all too well. And technically, it was open, but barely active. So there was a girl buried so young, and no one held responsible yet. So by the summer of 1996, investigators had come up completely empty, and every thread just led nowhere. So police turned their attention to the people closest to Nicole. And that summer, authorities arrested her stepfather, Ad, and her stepbrother, Andy, and they held them for 5 days each, and then they let them go. And neither arrest produced charges, and not a single piece of forensic evidence connected Ad or Andy to what happened to Nicole. There were no links, no witnesses, just nothing. They had nothing on the both of them. But the damage was already done because they were held for 5 days and word spread. And in the public eye, the arrest told a story that the evidence just didn't support. And reporters discussed the family structure. And they pointed out that Ad wasn't Nicole's biological father and that he was only her legal guardian. And it didn't matter that both men walked out of custody without a single charge filed against them because suspicion had already settled on the family like a stain. As a man who raised a girl as his own daughter and then lost her to a murder. It's just so awful. And a stepbrother who grew up alongside her and who lived in the same house, the grandmother's house, and he got hauled in as well. I just can't imagine how they both felt being scrutinized like that. And they were only suspects because the evidence didn't point to anyone else, basically. So they were just doing, process of elimination. And in a case with no answers, proximity became its own kind of guilt. And the family that had been grieving Nicole was now defending itself against the suspicion that one of them killed her. And though both men had been cleared, it didn't really matter. Because in a small community, in a case this public, the whispers don't follow the same rules as the courts. But as time went on, voices got quiet, and the years after the arrests were defined by silence. There were no new witnesses, forensic breakthroughs, or confessions, and the investigative team had already been cut down. Detectives moved on to other cases, but the file still stayed open, but fewer and fewer people were working on it. And in 2004, a cold case team pulled Nicole's case off the shelf, and they reviewed the evidence and re-examined what had been collected and looked for anything that might have been missed, but the case went right back where it had been. And breaking the case open again meant one of two things needed to happen. Someone who knew something would have to come forward, or the science would have to catch up to the evidence. So by 2011, 16 years had passed since Nicole's body was found beneath those branches, and the DNA samples were sealed away in evidence storage. And the original material had been collected with mid-90s technology and degraded by weeks of outdoor exposure. And the case had sat dormant since the failed 2004 review. And Andy, Nicole's stepbrother, had moved to England by then. And in 2011, from across the North Sea, he did something no one saw coming, and he went on Facebook and he confessed to killing his stepsister. The stepbrother who lived in the same grandmother's house, who'd grown up alongside her, who'd been hauled in once before back in 1996 and walked. Now he was saying it out loud in writing for anyone to read. I did it. So once the confession hit social media, law enforcement in England responded immediately, and they arrested Andy in the UK. And on March 30th, 2011, he was extradited back to the Netherlands, back in the country where he'd grown up, this time arriving in handcuffs. And Dutch authorities held him for approximately 5 days, the same length of time they'd held him back in 1996 when he was first suspected. But the confession didn't hold, and investigators still had nothing connecting him to the murder beyond his own words online. No forensics, no witnesses, nothing but a post on a screen. So again, they let him go. And the moment he was released, Andy just retracted his confession, because he hadn't done it, after all, he would say. But then he went further, and he would accuse his own father, Ad, of the murder, Nicole's stepfather. But it made no sense. A man confesses to killing his stepsister, takes it back, and then points the finger at the father who raised them both, with essentially zero evidence to back it up. And because of that, the accusation against Ad didn't lead to charges either. But something had shifted now, and whatever Andy was doing, it had dragged Nicole's name back into the headlines and made it impossible for the case to quietly slide back into a filing cabinet. And the confession triggered Dutch authorities to assemble a fresh cold case team and point them at her file. So for the first time in years, people were looking at the case again. And Andy was relieved. But Andy's relief carried a weight no one around him understood, because Andy had never killed anyone, because the Facebook confession was a lie, a calculated, deliberate lie. But he understood something most people don't. Confess to a murder, and the body gets exhumed, and new samples get taken, and modern testing gets applied, and the wheels turn again. And it was the only way he could think of to force the system's hand. And he knew it was a risk. A false confession doesn't come with a safety net, and if the legal system had moved faster than his plan accounted for, he could have ended up convicted of a crime he didn't commit. But to him, the alternative was worse, which was another decade of silence and the man who killed Nicole walking free. And even accusing his own father had been part of it. And Andy didn't explain his true motive publicly until 2016, when he said, quote, "I wanted her to get exhumed and get DNA off her. I kind of set myself up, and it could have gone horribly wrong. To get her exhumed, I had to put steps in place to get her exhumed. I went to police and said I did it. She is my sister. Absolutely, I miss her every day." Unquote. And this was 5 years after his confession. He waited 5 years. That's how long he let people believe what they wanted about him, but it was all by design. What an insanely amazing brother to have. Oh my goodness. Confessing to a murder just to get your body exhumed so the killer doesn't walk free. But did it work? Well, in September of 2011, authorities exhumed Nicole's remains, and the Netherlands Forensic Institute re-examined biological material and clothing traces, and all of it got processed through DNA technology that simply hadn't existed when Nicole was first found. And complex, degraded samples that had been borderline useless in 1995 could now potentially yield identifiable profiles. And following the exhumation, authorities made another decision, and they publicly confirmed for the first time that Nicole had in fact been. And this was information the earlier teams had documented internally, but deliberately kept from the public, like we spoke about before, because they weren't 100% about it. Now, the world finally knew, and authorities bumped the reward up to 15,000 euros for anyone who could help identify the killer. And a week later, police went public with a statement, and that is that they've recovered foreign DNA from Nicole's body, and they also reported receiving over 20 new leads. And 2 months after the exhumation, Nicole's remains were released back to the family. So the DNA was there, and it just took the right technology to finally see it. And now, investigators had a profile, and for the first time since 1995, the case was finally moving forward. Now, the updated testing at the Netherlands Forensic Institute produced clear results that the original investigation never could. And the results pointed to 3 different men who'd left DNA on Nicole. And the first profile belonged to her boyfriend at the time she disappeared. And that was expected due to their relationship. And the second profile belonged to a convicted from Helmond named Jos de G, and his DNA showed up in sperm traces and pubic hair that had been collected from Nicole's body. And the third profile belonged to an unknown male whose identity was never determined. But the match to Jos de G didn't come from the DNA alone, it came from pattern recognition. Because in September of 2000, a 20-year-old woman was attacked in Valkenswaard, a town just south of Eindhoven, and she was pulled from her bike and in an isolated location. And the man who committed the horrible crime was Jos de G. So the cold case team saw the parallel immediately. A young woman on a bike intercepted, taken somewhere isolated, and assaulted. And Nicole had been cycling to work in the dark when she vanished, and her body ended up concealed in woodlands 10 kilometers away. So the method was the exact same. And the cold case team compared de G's DNA profile against the unidentified traces recovered from Nicole, and the similarities were strong enough to trigger an arrest. Let's take a quick pause to talk about something that's genuinely really hard and terrifying, and that's just starting something new. Like, when I started this whole channel, I wasn't even sure what I was doing, and I would be thinking to myself, what if no one watches or listens? What do I do then? But it turns out believing in myself was the right call, and it helps to have a partner like Shopify on your side. Now, Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world and 10% of all e-commerce in the United States, from household names to brands just getting started. You can get going with hundreds of ready-to-use templates that match your brand style. But what if I get stuck, Chris? Well, Shopify is always around with award-winning 24/7 support. Plus, that iconic purple Shop Pay button means the best converting checkout on the planet. Fewer abandoned carts and more sales for you. So it's time to turn those what ifs into with Shopify today. So sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/cccm. Go to shopify.com/cccm. That's shopify.com/cccm. Thank you so much to Shopify for sponsoring the video and supporting the channel, and for helping me with all of my business endeavors. And let's get back to it. So in January of 2014, police arrested 46-year-old Yas Deji from Helmand. And he'd been living in a shelter home for about a month and a half, and he was in the home stretch of reintegration. He had one more supervised phase, and he'd be on his own again, which is horrifying to think about. But he never made it to the next step, luckily. And Deji was from Valkensvord, which is a town right on Eindhoven's doorstep where Nicole lived. And he was in his late 20s when she went missing. And on October 5th, 1995, the night before Nicole vanished, Deji walked out of his ex-girlfriend's place upset because the two had been fighting. And several hours later, Nicole left for work on her bicycle in the dark. And by the time police arrested him for Nicole's case, Deji already had 3 convictions on his record. How was he out and about? Why is this a thing? Kill it with fire, what? And his earliest known offense dated back to 1987, which was an essay connected to him only later through a DNA match. And he was sentenced to 17 months for a violent assault against his own girlfriend. And within months of that sentencing, authorities arrested him for the essay of a 20-year-old woman in Valkensvord. And 2 additional convictions followed for abusing his ex-girlfriend. Both assaults happened in her home. And in 2011, a court ordered 3 years of preventative detention along with mandatory psychiatric care. That is an abhorrently small sentence. Oh my God. And the psychological evaluation from his earlier sentencing didn't hold back. And a psychiatrist called Yas Deji, quote unquote, a vessel overflowing with hate. But yeah, let him walk! And the report warned of significant chance he'd re-offend if the underlying issues weren't properly treated. But despite all that, by January 2014, the system had moved him to the doorstep of freedom and placed him in a shelter home, just 6 short weeks from living on his own again. And he'd joined an amateur football club in Helmand, RKPVV, where he played in goal. And teammates found him spontaneous but withdrawn, but they liked him well enough. So with Deji apprehended, Andy sent a message to his friends saying, quote, "They finally got this monster after 19 years, unquote. All thanks to him, by the way. So in April 2014, prosecutors formally charged Yas Deji with and murder of Nicole Vanden Hark. Almost 2 decades after she was pulled from beneath a pile of branches, the case finally had a name attached to it, and that name had been in the system all along. So Yas Deji was originally charged with both murder and rape, but that didn't last. And on July 3rd, 2014, during a pretrial hearing in Den Bosch, prosecutors dropped the murder charge as the forensic evidence wouldn't support it. And he now faced trial for manslaughter and rape instead. And the family, understandably, was furious, and Andy called the reduction a betrayal of justice, and he argued that moving a victim's body is a deliberate act, one that should constitute murder, not the lesser charge. And Ad, Nicole's stepfather, went further, telling reporters, quote, "This man deserves the highest punishment there is. He has already attempted to murder 2 women in the past and has taken the life of my child. The Netherlands is not helped by this, that such a man may still walk the streets," unquote. Drop the mic. And prosecutors asked the court for a 14-year sentence if he was convicted on both counts, and the defense attorney, Jaap Knoester, planned to argue for full acquittal. Now, DG's account was built on strategic vagueness. First, he claimed he never crossed paths with Nicole around the time she went missing, and then he offered an alternative. Maybe the two of them had a consensual encounter in the days before her death. He just couldn't remember. Shut up. And his attorney pointed out that Nicole and his client moved through the same circles, the same hangouts, so a chance meeting was completely possible. Then the defense pushed further, and Knoester told the court that other males' DNA had also been recovered, which he said meant Nicole had been sexually active before her death. And he even floated the claim that she may have been pregnant when she was killed, with no basis, by the way. Insane thing to say about a murdered 15-year-old girl. An ad responded to the pregnancy claim directly, saying, quote, "These are lawyer shenanigans. He is the devil's advocate in the end. I do not want to comment on these allegations. I'll leave that to the Justice Department," unquote. And Andy kept his reaction brief, saying, quote unquote, "The defense attorney is a very clever man." And the prosecution rejected the entire framework, though. And consensual sex with a 15-year-old wasn't realistic, or a thing, by the way, since he was in his 20s. And the defense still had no believable explanation for why DG's DNA was on Nicole's body. And by October 2015, the case had been through 8 pretrial hearings, and the strategy was very clear: not to prove innocence, but to muddy the water enough that certainty became impossible. So basically, the central fight in the courtroom was on the reliability of the DNA match itself. And the whole reason DG was sitting there was a partial match between his DNA and what had been pulled from Nicole. Just partial, not complete. And that gap was the defense's primary weapon. And experts from 2 institutions testified in Den Bosch: the Netherlands Forensic Institute, or NFI, and the Independent Forensic Services, or IFS. And at the center of it all was the sperm recovered from Nicole's remains. And investigators had never been able to build a complete profile from it, and even if the IFS brought in a counter-expert, agreed the gap was unusual. Normally, semen yields a full profile. And the NFI's expert, Jeroen Koopman, explained why this case was different. Quote, "It is quite extraordinary that we were able to find usable DNA evidence after 6 weeks. It does not surprise me that no single profile came from it," unquote. There you go. Because 6 weeks of outdoor decomposition had degraded everything, and the sample wasn't clean to begin with, and at least 3 separate people's DNA had shown up in those semen traces. And 2 of the profiles were clear, believed to match DG and Nicole's boyfriend, but some peaks didn't conclusively match either man. And the NFI and the IFS couldn't agree on what the DNA actually proved. So the court brought in a 3rd set of eyes, and the samples were shipped to New Zealand, where analysts applied probabilistic genotyping, a math-driven method built to pull apart mixed DNA when several people's material ends up on the same item. They really have a job for everything. And no Dutch case had ever used it before. And the results, presented in April of 2016, were striking. And the odds that the 3 strands belonged to DG and 2 other specific individuals, rather than 3 strangers, were 2.28 million to 1. So across 2 continents, the takeaway was the same. DG's DNA was almost certainly part of that mixture, but very likely and beyond reasonable doubt don't mean the same thing, obviously. And the unknown 3rd profile still hung over the case, and the defense intended to use it. So a verdict was expected in 2015, and then 2 surprise witnesses blew the timeline apart. And both had done some time in the same psychiatric institution as DG, and each said separately that he'd told them about killing a girl. And they were both convinced that girl was Nicole. And the court postponed proceedings and called 15 people to testify about how DG and the 2 men had actually interacted. And DG tried to discredit one of them, claiming they'd gotten along like cat and dog inside the facility, but a psychiatrist from the clinic remembered the 2 of them sitting together playing poker. But in the end, neither man's statement made it into official evidence. And prosecutors said they believed the witnesses, but their testimony stayed out of the formal case, and the trial moved forward without it. But on November 21st, 2016, a unanimous panel found Jos DG guilty of and sentenced to 5 years. But on manslaughter, he was acquitted. And the reasoning came down to that unknown third DNA profile, because the court couldn't rule out that the unidentified man had played some role in Nicole's death. And with nothing beyond the trace evidence, it wouldn't connect DG to the killing itself. And everything else the defense had argued was rejected, and the judges found that Nicole and DG did not know each other before the day she vanished. And the consensual contact story was completely thrown out, and the promiscuity defense with it. And DG's sperm on Nicole's body indicated not consent, but none of it was enough to convict him of taking her life. And the court acknowledged what it was leaving unanswered. Quote, "We regret that the relatives have no clarity on what happened after the unquote. And the judges also declined to impose TBS, the Dutch system of psychiatric detention, reasoning that experts had assessed his risk of reoffending as minimal. And prosecutors had asked for 14 years, and he only got 5, with 2 already served in pretrial custody. So roughly only 3 years remaining. And the family just broke. And Nicole's stepmother, Jolanda Venderweden, shouted in court, quote, "What if this could happen to your children? This is simply unbelievable," unquote. And police let her out as relatives walked out in tears. And days later, ad appeared on a regional broadcast called Crack. Quote, "This is not a man, but a terrible creature," unquote. So the 5-year sentence lasted 8 days before it was challenged. And on November 29th, 2016, the public prosecutor appealed the manslaughter acquittal outright, arguing that and the killing were one act by one man. But the defense appealed too, contesting the conviction itself. So the whole case went back before the judges, and every count relitigated from scratch. And hearings opened on August 28th, 2018 at the Court of Appeals in Sertogenbos, sorry for the pronunciation, the same city as the first trial. And prosecutors again asked for 14 years, which I still think isn't enough. Life. Just in a hole for life. So there was the same defendant with the same forensic evidence, but one thing changed: the unknown third DNA trace. Because in the first trial, it had been the reason DG walked, as we know, and the appeal court saw it differently. They concluded the trace carried no real weight. It was minimal. Its origin couldn't be pinned down, and there were plenty of innocent ways it could have ended up there. Transfer contamination, incidental contact. Where the first court treated the trace as an open door, the appeal court closed it. And with that obstacle gone, the judges turned to what remained. DG's biological material had been found 3 times on Nicole's body, and the forced nature of the contact established at the first trial went unchallenged. And then there was what happened afterward. Nicole's body hidden under branches in a woodland 10 kilometers from where she was last seen. That kind of concealment doesn't just happen by accident. It's the behavior of someone trying not to get caught. And the appeal court drew a straight line from the to the killing to the disposal. One offender, one sequence of events, one man responsible for all of it. So on October 9th, 2018, the Court of Appeal convicted Jos DG of both and manslaughter and sentenced him to 12 years. Still not good enough. Still not good enough. But at least we know without a doubt who committed this heinous crime. And the court's language left no room for ambiguity, accusing him of, quote, forcing a young girl with her whole life ahead of her into sex and then killing her, unquote. And in its judgment, the evidence proved he beat a 15-year-old to death and buried her under branches so no one could find her. So 23 years after Nicole was pulled from beneath that pile of branches, a court had finally held someone accountable for putting her there. And the judges again declined TBS, and DG had been given it for a prior conviction and never finished it. And the court found it was no longer possible to tell whether his mental health had played any role in 1995. But DG wasn't finished, and he took the case to the Hoge Raad, the Dutch Supreme Court, arguing he hadn't received a fair trial, and his objections aimed at the appeal court's use of the DNA findings and its handling of the defense's challenges to expert witnesses. And the Advocate General reviewed the arguments and recommended they fail. So on June 16th, 2020, they dismissed every complaint, and the conviction was locked in. So no more appeals, no more hearings, nothing left to pursue. But there was one final adjustment. The court knocked 4 months off for how long the case had dragged on, turning 12 years into 11 years and 8 months. What are we doing over there in the Netherlands? Are you guys okay? What's going on? Just everywhere, honestly. It's not even the Netherlands. It's just like, I don't understand the sentencing for this type of thing. This man murdered a girl and defiled her, but it's a slap on the wrist. What are we doing? Again, whole for life or fire, you know? I don't understand, and I don't think I'll ever understand. But at this point, the case was closed, and the third male whose DNA appeared on Nicole's remains was never identified. And courts weighed it, argued over it, and set it aside as too small and too ambiguous to matter. And that question still hangs over the case, but the central one had been answered. Joost G. killed Nicole van den Hark, and the conviction was final. And it had taken a false confession, an exhumation, forensic science that didn't exist when Nicole died, and years of grinding and persistence. But someone was finally held responsible. Let's take a quick pause to talk about something I know about you, okay? You've been putting off making an appointment, haven't you? A doctor's appointment, dermatologist appointment, therapy appointment. Yeah, that's okay. I've been known to do that too. Until I started using ZocDoc. Now, ZocDoc is a free app and website that helps you find and book high-quality in-network doctors so you can find someone you love. There are over 150,000 providers across all 50 states and 200 plus specialties. You can search for specialty or symptom, read thousands of verified patient reviews, and book in person or by video. And you can also see real-time availability and book instantly. And appointments typically happen within 24 to 72 hours. I have been notorious for putting off doctor's appointments, but ZocDoc makes it so easy. I don't have an excuse anymore. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/CCCM to find and instantly book a doctor you love today. That's ZocDoc.com/CCCM. ZocDoc.com/CCCM. Thank you so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring the video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. So Joost G. was sentenced and the legal fight was over, but a verdict ends the legal question and it doesn't end anything else. And Andy van den Hark had given more to this case than anyone should have to, confessing to a murder he didn't commit to force it to open back up again. And it worked. And the boy who set himself on fire, basically, metaphorically, to light the path to justice actually got there. But on August 27th, 2021, Andy posted a final message on Facebook saying he was ready to say goodbye. And not long after, he would just with years of grief, suspicion, sacrifice, and waiting had proved to be too much for him. But he was the reason his stepsister's killer was identified, and yet the person who fought the hardest for Nicole didn't get to live in the world he'd helped create, the one where her killer was named, convicted, and locked away. And Ad van den Hark carried a different version of the same weight. And he had raised Nicole as his own, lost her to murder, and heard the word convicted 23 years after he buried her. And he was right to call the man who did it a terrible creature. But that is the end of this deep dive case on Nicole van den Hark. My heart, as always, goes out to the family and to her. What a horrible, horrible case. I just can't believe what the stepbrother did for her and everything he sacrificed, and in the end he's no longer with us, but I think that Nicole would have been extremely proud of what he did for her. But thank you so much for listening, and if you would like me to deep dive into any other cases, please let me know down below, and until then, I will see your beautiful face, and please stay safe out there, okay? Bye. Thank you to PDS Debt for supporting this channel. In another world, Elizabeth Short might have quietly slipped through history's fingers. She was just one more hopeful woman drawn west by Hollywood's glittering promises, arriving in a city known for breaking more hearts than it ever made stars. Another waitress rehearsing lines between shifts, believing deeply in the widespread lies that Los Angeles told dreamers desperate enough to listen. But fate had different, darker plans, because Elizabeth Short became immortal, not remembered for her charm or the dreams she chased, but tragically defined by the brutality of her death. But before the headlines labeled her the Black Dahlia, before her name became synonymous with mystery and unspeakable violence, she was simply Betty. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, intellectually beautiful-minded freak! And today, we are talking about one of the most infamous cold cases in all of history, and that is the case of the Black Dahlia, otherwise known as Elizabeth Short. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through the windshield into this cold case together. So on July 29th, 1924, Phoebe May Sawyer Short delivered her third daughter into the world, teetering on the edge of prosperity and collapse. And Elizabeth Ann Short entered life as the middle child among 5 sisters: Virginia May, Dorothea, Elizabeth, Elnora, and a little Muriel yet to come. And their father, Cleo Alvin Short Jr., had invested everything into a miniature golf course business during the recreational boom of the 1920s. What a cool business. Can you imagine your dad being a recreational miniature golf course business owner? I love mini golf. But in October 1929, everything would change because the stock markets would collapse and obliterate anyone's dream, including Cleo's miniature golf business. So his business would crumble, and then the weight of feeding 5 daughters and a wife just became unbearable for him. So on a cold morning in December of 1930, 6-year-old Elizabeth Short woke up to find her mother weeping at the kitchen table. And she would tell her daughter that Daddy's car had been discovered abandoned at the Charleston Bridge, doors open and keys inside. There was no note and no body. Just a 1926 Model T Ford sitting empty above the dark waters of the Charles River. And police would assume it was a sewer slide. And Phoebe, wanting to shelter her daughters from the knowledge of their father committing that, told them that their father simply drowned. So the family would have a memorial service for a man whose body was never found, and whose death would later prove to be the first of many lies that shaped Elizabeth Short's life. So Phoebe Short would move her and her 5 daughters to a cramped Medford, Massachusetts apartment, working as a bookkeeper while neighbors whispered about the widow with too many mouths to feed. And that's when Elizabeth's childhood would become a series of doctor's visits and sleepless nights, because she developed severe asthma that would actually seize her lungs without warning, leaving her gasping while her sisters watched in complete terror. And bronchitis would follow, each infection just weakening her respiratory system further. So the medical bills just consumed what little money Phoebe had. And Elizabeth would learn really early on in life that her existence just cost too much. And at 15, doctors would recommend surgery to remove part of her lung tissue. So she would have the surgery, but that procedure would leave deep scars across her back and a deeper understanding that her body would always betray her. And the recovery required her to be in bed for months on end. So during this time, she would read movie magazines and just dream of a place where the air itself didn't completely drown her lungs. And that's when doctors would recommend that she actually move to a warmer climate. And as her mother, Phoebe, later told reporters, quote unquote, Betty was a sophomore when she left high school in Medford. She had asthma. Every winter she would go south to Florida as a waitress. Then she would come back home in the summer. So Elizabeth began spending her winters in Florida with relatives, breathing easier among palm trees and orange groves. So the seasonal relocations kind of taught her to live like a migrant, never fully settling anywhere and never calling any place home. So at this point in her life, high school kind of became impossible because she was moving so much. And Elizabeth's absences multiplied as her health problems persisted. So at 16, she would drop out entirely, and her formal education ended before it truly even began. So she would spend most of her teenage years just reading ferociously, educating herself through magazines and library books, while her healthy sisters pursued normal adolescence experiences. So she was kind of left in the dark for the most part of her childhood. But during this time, she just absorbed Hollywood gossip columns like scripture, memorizing the names and romantic entanglements of screen goddesses who seemed to breathe rarefied air. And it was during these years where she thought to herself that she could maybe be one of those women. So December of 1942 would come around, and it would redefine everything in Elizabeth's life, because a letter would arrive from Vallejo, California. And the handwriting looked familiar, but impossible, like correspondence from a ghost. Because by reading this letter, she would find out that her father, Cleo Short, hadn't actually drowned in the Charles River 12 years earlier. He had just walked away from his debt and his wife and his 5 daughters without even looking back. So while his family mourned and struggled through the Depression, Cleo had been living in the California shipyards. So Elizabeth, being shocked as ever, would write back to her father expressing her desire to visit and care for him. And Cleo would later say that he sent his daughter $200, and in December of 1942, 18-year-old Elizabeth made her way down to Vallejo, California, to reunite with her father that she once believed had been dead for the past 12 years. And perhaps another girl would have refused such a cruel reunion. But Elizabeth, however, saw opportunity wrapped up in betrayal, because her health still demanded warm weather, and her prospects in Massachusetts remained pretty bleak. No offense to Massachusetts. And California represented the closest she would ever get to Hollywood without buying a bus ticket to nowhere. So what did she have to lose, really? You know, her father had already stolen her childhood. At least now she could steal something back. So Elizabeth's train would pull into Vallejo, carrying her possessions in 2 battered suitcases and a head full of Hollywood fantasies. And at 18 years old, Elizabeth possessed ethereal beauty, pale skin, large eyes, and dark hair that caught sunlight. But the reunion with Cleo Short lasted long enough for both parties to realize their big mistake. Because 12 years of separation had created strangers who shared only genetics and mutual disappointment. Sounds like my father. I don't want to talk about it. Anyway, but within the months, father and daughter reached an unspoken agreement, really. And that was that they would pretend to be family while actively avoiding each other. Again, very simple. Well, my dad didn't pretend to be dead for 12 years, so she does have that on me, that's for sure. I wouldn't put it past him, So eventually, Elizabeth would move out of her father Cleo's house and support herself by waitressing and the occasional kindness of men who found her mysteriously intriguing. Because she would tell different stories to different men. And sometimes her father was dead, and sometimes he was alive. She just kind of like felt it out to see what kind of story she would make up. And sometimes her health problems would even disappear or multiply depending on the sympathy required in the moment. So her background shifted from tragedy to triumph as the situation demanded. Because at this point in her life, truth became a luxury she just couldn't afford. And the lies came very naturally because Elizabeth had learned from a master, which was her father, the guy who pretended to be dead for 12 years. But it was during this time period that she would meet Major Matthew Gordon, who was an Air Force officer with kind eyes and genuine affection for the mysterious girl who seemed to drift through his life like smoke. And for perhaps the only time in her adult life, Elizabeth allowed herself to believe in permanence, and they would become engaged. But then came the telegram, and it would say that Major Gordon's plane had crashed during training exercises just days before the war's end. Oh, just heart-wrenching, horrible, terrible. This girl's dad was dead for 12 years, popped up, is an asshole, and then she gets engaged, and then he dies days before he's supposed to return. She just literally could not catch a break. It was just another death, another abandonment, and just another reason to stop trusting in happy endings. So Elizabeth's response to losing Major Gordon revealed the pattern that would define her remaining years, and that was when life became unbearable, she simply left. She would go to California, Florida, Massachusetts, Indiana, and Texas. So Elizabeth Short just became this beautiful ghost haunting bus stations and diners across America, staying long enough to catch her breath before moving on. But the constant movement served multiple purposes, because new environments couldn't suffocate her like familiar places. And fresh starts meant fresh stories and clean slates. And most importantly, staying in motion meant she never had to admit that she was kind of going nowhere in life at this point. And it was during these wandering years that Elizabeth perfected the art of survival through charm and mystery. She would learn which sad stories produced meals and which smiles earned bus fares and which promises could be made without the intention of keeping them. And her beauty just opened doors, whereas her damaged health and tragic backstory kept them open long enough to rest. So the pattern of intimacy followed by abandonment just became a signature dance of hers. And by July of 1946, she would be 22 years old, and she would face a choice between finding stability or accepting permanent defeat. So she would give California a chance once more. And this time it would be different, she would tell herself. This time she would stay long enough to make something happen. But as we know, she would unfortunately be wrong. So in July 1946, Elizabeth Short would step off the bus at Hollywood and Vine with $20 to her name and infinite belief in her own transformation. And she would find a room behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard. And she would be close enough to hear music and laughter that represented everything she wanted to become. And Elizabeth would make the rounds every aspiring actress knew by heart, which was studio gates, casting calls, and auditions that led to nowhere. Because Hollywood at this point, and honestly now, operated on connections she didn't possess, and talent she had not yet developed. So without training, experience, or influential friends, her chances were essentially zero, especially in this day and age. But Elizabeth Short had never required realistic expectations to fuel her dreams, so she continued pursuing auditions while working as a waitress. And her beauty would attract attention, and that attention came mostly from men with money and influence. So she would date frequently, but briefly, moving from suitor to suitor. So the financial pressure was mounting steadily, and with rent required as a regular payment and food costs that she did not possess, she actually began staying overnight with various men, not necessarily for romance, but just for basic survival. Because with these men, she had a warm bed, a hot meal, and a temporary reprieve from poverty's grinding demands. And it was during this period where her clothing and her whole wardrobe basically turned predominantly black. And whether this represented genuine fashion preferences or practical necessity remains unclear. Maybe dark colors hid stains better than light ones, that's why I wear them. Or black outfits could transition from day to night with minimal alteration. There's many theories, but what we do know is that the nickname, the Black Dahlia, emerged sometime during these final months. But through its exact origin remains disputed. Some people also say it could have come from her dark wardrobe matched with her dark raven-like hair, and others suggested it's because she had a habit of disappearing like shadows. And a few even connected it to the 1946 film The Blue Dahlia, starring Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake. But the name captured something essential about Elizabeth Short during her Hollywood period. Just beautiful, mysterious, and tinged with darkness that people found simultaneously attractive and unsettling. So January 1947 arrived with unusual rain and growing desperation. Because at this point, Elizabeth's financial situation deteriorated beyond casual concern into genuine crisis. And her friends back in San Diego reported that she seemed frightened during her final visits, constantly looking over her shoulder as if she was expecting some kind of pursuit from someone. And that's when something changed, because the confident drift that had sustained Elizabeth through years of uncertainty had transformed into panicked flight. And she actually spoke of hiding from someone, but she never revealed details about it. So the mysterious nature that served as her trademark became desperate secrecy. And on July 9th, 1947, Robert Red Manley drove Elizabeth from San Diego to Los Angeles, dropping her at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA. And she would carry a small suitcase with her, and she would promise him that she would stay in touch. So Red would say goodbye and watch her walk into the hotel's ornate lobby. But after that, no one can say with certainty what happened during the next 6 days, because Elizabeth Short had vanished completely, and the hotel had no record of her registration, and friends received no phone calls, and the men who'd previously provided temporary shelter heard nothing from her. So it was 6 days of absolute mystery, until the morning of January 15th, 1947. Whew, what a case so far. Real-life stories like this can remind you how quickly a real-life situation can spiral when you feel cornered and completely out of options. And while most of us, hopefully, will never face a true crime situation, a different kind of nightmare can lurk in our everyday lives, and that is
debt. But thankfully, PDS Debt can help. Thank you to PDS Debt for supporting this channel. So be honest, do those credit card, medical, or personal loan bills ever feel like they're cutting into your paycheck and taking it for a getaway drive? If so, I got something that can give your finances a happy ending. Because thousands of people every single month trust PDS Debt because they don't just juggle numbers. They empower you to take control. So their tech digs into your unique situation. So there's no cookie cutter plan. There's just a clear cut path to freedom that fits your lifestyle. And your credit score? Don't sweat it. Because there's no minimum scorecard here. Bad, fair, somewhere in between. PDS is focused on saving you money, paying off debt faster, and funneling cash back into your own savings. And you can start in 30 seconds by heading to pdsdebt.com/KallMeKris. And there you can complete a totally free debt assessment. And if you have eligible debt, you qualify. It's that simple. So take 30 seconds right now and run that free analysis at pdsdebt.com/KallMeKris. Again, that pdsdebt.com/KallMeKris. And start writing your own plot twist toward financial freedom. Thank you again to PDS Debt for supporting this channel, and let's get back to it. So on the morning of January 15th, 1947, Betty Berzinger walked south on Norton Avenue in Leimert Park with her 3-year-old daughter, Anne, heading to collect her husband's work boots from the repair shop. The vacant lot between 39th and Coliseum Streets had become part of the neighborhood landscape, which was another empty space waiting for post-war development. And Betty had passed it countless times without a second glance. But at 10 a.m. this morning, something pale in the weeds caught her eye, and her first thought involved practical annoyance, because she thought someone had just dumped another piece of furniture in the lot. And she thought probably a mannequin from a downtown department store, broken and discarded like so much of post-war America's access. So Betty would approach the object, and the pale object would lay about 30 feet from the sidewalk, positioned too deliberately for casual dumping though. So as she drew closer, impossible details started to emerge. And that was that the mannequin had real hair, and the hair was black and lustrous and spread across the dirt. And it also had actual human flesh. Flesh that was alabaster white against the dark brown earth. And the truth that would haunt Betty for the rest of her life was that this wasn't a mannequin at all. And Betty's daughter, Anne, would later recall her mother's scream as the loudest sound she's ever heard. But the screaming came second, because Betty's first instinct was protection, and she would grab Anne and lift her away from the sight completely, shielding the child's eyes while her own mind struggled to process what actually lay before them. And that thing was a woman's body, bisected at the waist with surgical precision, with the upper half positioned 12 inches north of the lower half, arms raised above the head in a grotesque parody of ballet. And her legs were also spread in a V formation that suggested both vulnerability and display. And this positioning was just too deliberate for accident. It was too theatrical for impulse. Someone had arranged this corpse like a macabre art installation, ensuring maximum visual impact for whoever discovered it first. So Betty would run to the nearest house, pounding on the door until neighbors answered and let her use the phone. And her hysterical call to police would take several attempts to decipher. And she would say, quote unquote, "There's a body in the lot. A woman. She's been cut in half." It's just horrifying. And like, I can't even imagine coming across that and with the daughter. It's a nightmare. So the desk sergeant initially assumed he was dealing with some sort of domestic disturbance or perhaps even a neighborhood prank, because dismembered corpses didn't just appear in a middle-class residential area on Wednesday mornings. And he would say, quote unquote,
"Ma'am, are you certain it's a human body?"
And she would say, "I'm looking right at it." And that simple confirmation launched the largest homicide investigation in LAPD history. So Los Angeles in 1947 operated under unwritten rules that prioritized sensationalism over investigation. And newspaper photographers monitored police radio frequencies, and often they would arrive at crime scenes before the detectives would actually get there. And the Black Dahlia discovery followed this pattern with catastrophic precision. And by 10:30 a.m. that morning, newspaper photographers had reached Norton Avenue, and their speed cameras would be clicking away while police cars remained blocks distant. And the Los Angeles Examiner and the Herald Express photographers documented the scene from every single angle, unknowingly destroying evidence with each footstep. Just idiots. And the afternoon's editions would feature these images on the front page, forever defining how America visualized the Black Dahlia case. And police detective Harry Hansen finally reached the scene at 10:45 a.m., discovering his crime scene had already been contaminated by journalists who had positioned themselves for optimal photography rather than evidence preservation. So Hansen's first official act in the investigation was to arrest every single reporter present. Well, threatened to. He didn't actually arrest all of them, though the damage was already irreversible. Because at this point, the photographers had already trampled any potential footprints, disturbed soil samples, and established sightlines that drew attention to specific details while obscuring others. And their presence just guaranteed that any subsequent investigation would operate from a compromised foundation completely. And modern crime scene protocols actually exist specifically because of the disasters like January 15th, 1947. So Detective Hansen's initial examination revealed details that transformed a shocking discovery into something approaching the impossible, because the bisection had been performed using a technique called a hemicorporectomy, which was the complete separation of the upper body and lower body at the waist. And in 1947, this procedure existed only in medical textbooks and the most advanced surgical suites. And the precision required for this procedure suggested someone with formal anatomical training and access to the appropriate instruments to do the procedure. And the cut would run cleanly through the lumbar spine at the L2, L3 vertebrae level, requiring both strength and knowledge of human skeletal structure. So whoever performed this operation understood exactly where to position their blade for maximum efficiency. But the surgical precision didn't just end with the bisection itself, because the killer had also carved a Glasgow smile extending from each corner of the victim's mouth to her ears. And there were also additional that removed flesh from both her thighs and her breast, though those ones appeared more frenzied than systematic. And her internal organs had also been and positioned beneath her buttocks, suggesting ritualistic, rather medical motivation. And fecal matter would also be found inside of her stomach. Horrifying. So the combination of both surgical expertise and sadistic frenzy painted a portrait of someone operating under two distinct psychological impulses. And those were clinical detachment and explosive rage. And complete exsanguination presented the investigators' most puzzling element, and that is that the corpse contained absolutely no blood. Not in the major vessels, not pooled in dependent areas, like when a body is sitting somewhere for a long time, it kind of pools where it is sitting, like if it's on the back, it'll kind of pool in the midsection, and not even trapped in smaller capillaries. Every single drop of her blood had been methodically drained using techniques that belonged in embalming parlors, not torture chambers. And the killer had also even washed her body before transport. So no trace of evidence remained under fingernails and hair or even on skin surfaces. And the soap residue suggested multiple cleanings with commercial grade detergents that were strong enough to remove DNA evidence that wouldn't be understood for another 40 years down the road. So this guy was meticulous. And it's interesting how meticulous he was, given that in 1947, forensic awareness bordered on the prophetic. They didn't have a lot going on in terms of forensic evidence. So the killer seemed to anticipate investigative techniques that didn't even exist yet, taking precautions against evidence collection methods still decades in the future. And the positioning of her body reinforced the theatrical elements, because the body lay precisely parallel to the sidewalk, with arms framing the head and legs spread in a perfect symmetry. So someone had spent considerable time arranging this display in an exposed location where discovery was inevitable. So the risk suggested either extreme confidence or complete psychological detachment, or both. So at 11:30 a.m. that morning, Detective Hansen would make a decision that would revolutionize criminal identification procedures forever, because the victim's fingerprints remained intact despite the extensive mutilation, suggesting the killer either overlooked this detail or deliberately preserved them. And Hansen would order a complete fingerprint collection. And then he would contact the FBI's newly established identification division in Washington, D.C. And what would happen next would represent a technological breakthrough that would become standard procedure within a decade, because the FBI had recently installed sound photo equipment. It was basically a primitive fax system capable of transmitting photographs over telephone lines, which is pretty cool. And Hansen's fingerprint cards were photographed in Los Angeles. And then they were transmitted across the continent to the FBI's headquarters at 1:15 p.m. Pacific time that same day, which again, very impressive for that time. And only 56 minutes later, the transmission contained a name. And that name was Elizabeth Ann Short, with the date of birth July 29th, 1924. And this identification would actually originate from a 1943 arrest in Santa Barbara for underage drinking. And because of that arrest, Elizabeth's prints had actually been filed with the FBI as part of a standard booking procedure. And by doing that would create a permanent record that survived 4 years until needed for the most famous murder case in American history. So the sound photo system would become the foundation for modern digital evidence sharing. But technology at this point could only provide a name. And everything else about Elizabeth Short's final days remained locked in a mystery that defied conventional investigation. So crime scene analysis in 1947 relied primarily on photography, measurements, and detectives' intuition. And forensic science existed in primitive form, lacking the sophisticated tools that would emerge during the following decades, as we know. Nevertheless, certain facts emerged that challenged basic assumptions about criminal behavior. And one of those facts was that the killer transported a 115-pound corpse to Norton Avenue and would position it in mathematical precision, then depart without leaving any traceable evidence. And this series of events would require planning, physical strength, and intimate knowledge of the neighborhood's traffic patterns, because this vacant lot offered no concealment during daylight hours, and houses surrounded the space on 3 sides with clear sightlines from multiple windows. So it's crazy that no one saw this happening, because no neighbors reported hearing anything unusual or seeing anything unusual during the evening or even in the morning. So both possibilities suggested local knowledge that extended beyond casual familiarity, but the physical evidence still remained very sparse. But they would see a cement sack near the body that showed traces of blood, though not enough to suggest the murder location, of course. And they would also find a heel print in the dirt that measured to about a size 8.5 men's shoes, though thousands of Los Angeles residents matched this specification. There would also be no murder weapon recovered, despite extensive searches through storm drains and dumpsters throughout the area. So the instruments used for dismemberment had vanished as completely as the killer's identity. So by sunset on January 15th, 1947, investigators faced a crime that seemed to violate fundamental assumptions about human behavior completely. So they could only ask one question, and that was, where had Elizabeth Short spent the last 6 days of her life? So they would go to the Biltmore Hotel, but there would be no record of her registration despite witness accounts of her arrival. And friends would receive no contact despite her frequent communication with them. And the men she saw regularly didn't hear from her at all in those 6 days. So it begs the question, how had the killer gained Elizabeth's cooperation? Because there were rope burns on her wrists and her ankles that indicated prolonged restraint, but no defensive wounds that suggested she had submitted without struggle. So the implications ranged from drug-induced compliance to willing participant with someone she trusted. So where exactly did this torture and murder take place? Because this procedure required hours in a controlled environment with access to running water, and surgical instruments and disposal methods for massive quantities of blood, as we know. And also, why choose this theatrical presentation? Because the killer could have disposed of the body permanently using methods that precluded discovery. Clearly, he was smart enough, as we know. But instead, they selected a very public location and arranged the corpse to ensure maximum visual impact. So each question just led to dozens more, creating an investigation labyrinth that would consume thousands of man-hours over the following decades. So Elizabeth Short's from unknown victim to national obsession had finally begun. And afternoon papers would hit the street with banner headlines and crime scene photographs. And radio stations interrupted programming with hourly updates. And the LAPD, unprepared for a media attention of this magnitude, found themselves conducting both a criminal investigation and just managing a public circus. And back at LAPD headquarters, Detective Harry Hansen studied crime scene photographs that were spread across his desk. And each image would reveal details that defied explanation. Positioning too perfect for hasty disposal, mutilations too systemic for passion alone, and forensic awareness too sophisticated for 1947. So he knew that someone had planned this murder with military operation and executed with surgical precision and theatrical political sensibility. So Hansen would pull out a notebook and write across the first page, quote unquote, Elizabeth Short, Black Dahlia case, January 15th, 1947. And he had no way of knowing that he had just titled the most famous unsolved murder in American history. And 16 detectives were assigned to what photographs had already dubbed the Dahlia case. And phone lines would buzz from reporters, amateur sleuths, and attention seekers claiming knowledge of the victim or the killer. And the questions would haunt investigators for decades. Who possessed the medical knowledge, the psychological detachment, and local familiarity necessary to transform Elizabeth Short into America's most notorious murder victim? And the answer lay somewhere in Los Angeles, protected by 6 days of silence. And that silence was about to be shattered by the largest criminal investigation in the city's history, and by the killer himself, who would soon contact the newspaper directly with evidence that should have remained forever secret. So on January 16th, 1947, the LAPD Chief Clements Harrell announced the largest criminal investigation in LA history to a room packed with detectives, reporters, and politicians. And he said, quote unquote, "We will find Elizabeth Short's killer. No expense will be spared," and it definitely wasn't. And by month's end, 750 investigators worked on the case. Detectives would abandon other homicides to chase leads that led to nowhere. Laboratory technicians processed evidence that revealed nothing. And within 6 months, Chief Harrell would resign in disgrace. And within a year, key evidence would begin disappearing from police storage. So the investigation that began with unprecedented resources would end up in complete failure. And in January of 1947, optimism ran high. Because how difficult could it be to solve one murder in a city of 2 million people? And the answer would redefine everything LA understood about criminal investigation. And on January 16th, 1947, the LA Examiner's phone would ring at 11:47 a.m. And the person on the other line would say, "This is the man who killed the Black Dahlia. I want to give myself up, but not to the police. I want to surrender to you." And the person that picked up the phone was city editor James Richardson, whose reporter's instincts overrode any sort of caution, and he would pick up a pencil and he would say back to the person on the phone, "Where do you want to meet?" And the person on the phone would say, "I'll contact you again soon. Watch for a package." And then the line would go dead, leaving Richardson with the first direct communication with Elizabeth Short's killer, and the beginning of the media circus that would destroy any chance of solving the case. Because what happened next violated every principle of criminal investigation that would be codified for another 30 years. So Richardson would call the LAPD headquarters, reporting the conversation to Detective Harry Henson. But he also alerted every single reporter in the building, like a moron. And within hours, the Examiner had announced the killer's phone call on the front page, complete with speculation about the voice's accent and psychological profile. Just horrible media practice. Because if the caller was indeed Elizabeth Short's murderer, he now knew the police were monitoring newspaper communications. So the tactical advantage belonged entirely to someone who performed theatrical games over straightforward confession. But the Examiner's decision to publicize the contact represented just the beginning of the media interference that would ultimately sabotage the entire investigation. So on January 24th, 1947 at 1:30 p.m., a United States Postal Service clerk at the Los Angeles terminal noticed an unusual package that was addressed to Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers. Very specific. But the envelope addressed in letters cut from newspapers and magazines and contained items that should have remained forever secret. And those items were Elizabeth Short's social security card, a birth certificate, photographs, and an address book belonging to Mark Hansen, the owner of the Florentine Gardens nightclub. And the accompanying message, assembled from magazine clippings, read, quote,
"Here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow."
So f***ing scary and creepy. Oh my god. And every item had been soaked in gasoline to remove any sort of fingerprint. And this was a forensic countermeasure that demonstrated sophisticated criminal thinking. This guy was playing chess. He was thinking 10 steps ahead in every move he made. But the package's most significant element wasn't what it contained necessarily, because the killer had mailed Elizabeth's personal effects to newspapers rather than police, ensuring maximum publicity while maintaining complete control over information flow. This guy just wanted to be in the headlines. So Detective Hansen would arrive at the Examiner building to find reporters already photographing the contents. Stop photographing everything. And they're also handling potential evidence without gloves, of course. and speculating about meanings that would influence public perception for decades. So the killer at this point, and just through the entire case, had completely outmaneuvered professional investigators by understanding something they hadn't yet learned. And that was that in media-saturated crimes, publicity can be weaponized against law enforcement. And we see this in cases in the future, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, to present. So by February 1947, LAPD headquarters received 12 confessions daily, saying, quote unquote,
I killed the Black Dahlia.
And this became Los Angeles' most popular false admission. And attention seekers and mentally ill individuals claim responsibility with elaborate stories. And detectives spent thousands of hours investigating confessions containing no verifiable details. But the most elaborate one came from Daniel S. Voorhees, who provided a 17-page handwritten account of torturing and killing Elizabeth Short. And his narrative included specific crime details and surgical techniques. And detectives would spend 6 weeks verifying his story before discovering Voorhees had copied every detail from newspaper accounts. Thank you, media, you f***ing idiots, again. And he'd actually been incarcerated in New York during Elizabeth's murder, so it was just another dead end. And when confronted, Voorhees even admitted that he did everything because he wanted to be famous. Idiot. And by year's end, LAPD had processed 67 false confessions, but this number would eventually exceed 500, making this the most falsely confessed crime in American history. And each bogus admission required investigation, consuming resources that could have pursued legitimate leads. So just idiot people wasting time, wasting precious time. So the surgical precision of Elizabeth Short's bisection convinced investigators that her killer possessed formal anatomical training. So Detective Hansen ordered comprehensive background checks on every medical professional, student, and technician in Los Angeles County. So the University of Southern California Medical School became ground zero for an investigation that would scrutinize scalpels, class schedules, and students' psychological profiles. And UCS administrators provided complete enrollment records dating back 5 years. And investigators would eventually interview 412 medical students, and 89 faculty members, and 156 hospital residents. Meanwhile, they would examine laboratory access logs, equipment inventories, and disposal procedures for anatomical specimens. And the hemicorporectomy technique used to bisect Elizabeth's body had been developed in the 1930s for treating specific cancers and traumatic injuries. And in 1947, fewer than 50 surgeons in Los Angeles possessed the training necessary to perform this specific procedure. So investigators would create a master list of these qualified surgeons, and then they would begin the painstaking process of verifying each individual's whereabouts during January 9th to January 15th of 1947. And they would look at hospital schedules, surgery logs, and witness statements and slowly eliminate suspects one by one. But this entire investigation would just reveal something very troubling, and that is that the killer's anatomical knowledge exceeded what could be learned through casual medical exposure. And whoever dismembered Elizabeth Short's body understood human circulatory systems and tissue composition at a professional level. But medical training alone couldn't explain the killer's sophistication, because a complete exsanguation required embalming knowledge typically possessed only by morticians and medical examiners. And the forensic awareness just demonstrated advanced understanding of evidence collection and preservation as well. So the killer represented a convergence of medical expertise, mortuary science, and criminal sophistication that basically shouldn't have existed in 1947. So who the f*** could know all of this? So of the 150 suspects questioned by LAPD over the decades, 4 names stood out, because each possessed surgical knowledge, opportunity, and connections to Elizabeth Short that made seasoned detectives take notice. And the first one was the genius doctor, George Hill Hodel Jr. And George possessed an IQ of 186 and worked as a prominent Los Angeles physician. He was born in 1907, and he moved in elite social circles and possessed the medical expertise for a hemicorporectomy, the surgical technique used to cleanly separate Short's upper body from her lower body. And the specialized procedure appeared only in 1930s medical textbooks, and the timeline converged in October 1949. because Hodell's teenage daughter actually accused him of SA, triggering an investigation that actually revealed connections to Elizabeth Short stretching back to 1946. And eyewitnesses even claimed knowledge of their relationship. And the LAPD District Attorney's Office assembled an 18-man task force. And for 2 months, from February through March 1950, investigators would bug Hodell's home with electronic surveillance equipment. And the operation recorded all conversations inside the house. And on March 14th, 1950, the equipment captured Hodell saying, quote unquote,
"Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they can't prove it now."
"Excuse me?" And the surveillance would continue after this non-confession confession. And Hodell's recorded conversations revealed intimate knowledge of the murder's details that were never released to the public. Red flag! Because he would discuss the positioning of the body, the surgical techniques employed, and the theatrical staging designed to shock and terrorize. But within days of the district attorney preparing arrest warrants, Dr. George Hill Hodell Jr. boarded a plane to the Philippines. And he would never return to Los Angeles soil. Red flag, just saying. And decades later, his son, Steve Hodell, a retired LAPD detective, discovered photographs hidden in his father's belongings. And some researchers believe that these images show Elizabeth Short alive and posed before her transformation into the Black Dahlia. But others dismiss them as complete coincidence. And this genius doctor would die in 1999, taking his secrets to the grave. He's a top one for me. Too much suspicion. But that brings us to suspect number 2. And that is the mortician's assistant, Leslie Dillon. So Leslie Dillon worked as a bellhop, a aspiring writer, and a mortician's assistant. These were jobs that gave him familiarity with corpses and embalming techniques. And in 1948, he actually wrote an unsolicited letter to the LAPD psychiatrist, Dr. J. Paul De River. And the letter contained details of Elizabeth Short's murder that had never been released to the public. And Dillon claimed that a friend had committed the killing. And he described the surgical techniques with clinical precision. So he knew about the rope burns on Short's wrists, and the forced ingestion that filled her stomach with fecal matter, and the hours of torture that preceded her death. So LAPD investigators brought Dillon to Los Angeles for questioning, naturally, and the mortician's assistant displayed intimate knowledge of the crime scene's theatrical staging. And he would know the positioning of Short's arm above her head and the wide V formation of her legs and the complete exsanguination that drained every drop of blood from her body. And even more disturbing, if we can get there, is that Dillon possessed connections to Mark Hansen, which was the nightclub owner whose address book was found soaked in gasoline alongside Short's belongings in that package sent to the newspapers. Puzzle pieces are puzzle piecing. And his alibis crumbled under scrutiny. And his behavior during interrogation set off alarm bells among seasoned detectives. Yet after extensive questioning, the LAPD officials cleared Dillon of suspicion. Somehow! And the mortician's assistant sued the department for false arrest and won. You know, what do they know? Maybe it was just all a coinkydink. Maybe it was all a coinkydink. I don't know. And in 2017, author Pugh Itwell published Black Dahlia Red Rose, presenting evidence that Leslie Dillon orchestrated Short's murder. And the book argues that previous investigators dismissed crucial connections linking Dillon to the crime. But the bellhop mortician just eventually vanished into obscurity. And his intimate knowledge of death and dismemberment just faded into the Los Angeles criminal archives. And that brings us to suspect number 3. And that is Jack Anderson Wilson. So between 1934 and 1938, the Cleveland torso murders claimed 12 victims in Ohio, and each showed surgical dismemberment and theatrical body positioning, techniques identical to those of Elizabeth Short's murder. But the killings stopped abruptly in 1938, and Jack Anderson Wilson became the prime suspect in both the Cleveland murders and the Black Dahlia case, because he possessed medical training, surgical knowledge, and he relocated from Cleveland to Los Angeles around the time of the Ohio killings ending. So in 1980, LAPD detective John St. John reopened the Black Dahlia case and focused intensely on Wilson, because the detective believed he stood on the verge of solving the Los Angeles most famous cold case, and he would prepare arrest warrants. So he would gather evidence linking Wilson to both the Cleveland murders and Short's death. But on February 4th, 1982, Jack Anderson Wilson would die in a house fire. And the timing just seemed impossibly convenient. Just as authorities had closed in, the prime suspect perished in flames that consumed potential evidence along with his body. But before Wilson's death, author John Gilmore claimed that suspect provided a deathbed confession. In that confession, he admitted to the Black Dahlia murder and described the details that matched the crime scene's horrific reality. But Detective St. John would take his suspicions to the grave, just convinced that Wilson's death robbed Los Angeles of justice for Elizabeth Short. So, who knows? All of these suspects, it's like, they could be them. I have no idea, and we'll probably never know. But that brings us to suspect number 4, and that is Mark Hansen. So Mark Hansen, as we know, owned the Florentine Gardens nightclub where Elizabeth Short rented a room behind the building her final months in Los Angeles. And the nightclub owner's connection to Short extended beyond landlord and tenant, because friends actually reported romantic involvement between Hansen and the aspiring actress. And she would also work at his establishment, and she moved in the same social circles as him. And she trusted him enough to list his contacts in her personal address book. And that address book surfaced in the package sent to the newspaper in January 24th, 1947. So someone had carefully selected Hansen's business contacts and included them alongside Short's birth certificate and social security card. And the items were, as we know, soaked in gasoline to remove any sort of fingerprints. So LAPD investigators would subject Hansen to extensive questioning, and they would also surveil his home. And they would examine his alibi on the night of Short's disappearance and the 6 days between January 9th and January 15th, 1947. And Hansen would provide inconsistent statements about his relationship with Short. And he would kind of downplay their connection while evidence suggested a deeper involvement. And his business operated in Hollywood's shadow economy, where young women traded companionship for security, similar to what Elizabeth Short was doing. But despite intensive investigation, authorities never charged Hansen for Short's murder. And no definitive evidence linked him to the crime or the surgical dismemberment that required medical expertise. So the nightclub owner just kind of faded into Los Angeles history, leaving behind questions about his role in Elizabeth Short's final days, or if he had any sort of connection to her actual killer. Because I really don't think that he was the actual killer, but could have been involved. Who knows? And several other suspects drew police attention over the decades, including Dr. Walter Bailey. He had surgical skills and lived near Short's last known locations. And then there was Bugsy Siegel, and he represented the organized crime angle, though the theatrical nature of Short's murder didn't really match typical mob killings. And Orson Welles, he was actually accused by a childhood friend, Mary Pacios, who claimed the director's artistic temperament and anatomical knowledge enabled such calculated violence. But investigators gave the theory very little credence. And then there was George Knowlton, who was accused by his daughter Janice in her book, but DNA testing later discredited her claims completely. But there was also a wider pattern, because the Black Dahlia murder didn't happen in isolation. And between 1934 and 1949, other women across America were being surgically dismembered with techniques that required medical training and specialized knowledge, on top of these bodies being positioned for maximum visual impact, and also drained of their blood completely. So Elizabeth Short's killer might have been practicing these techniques for years before January 1947. And the surgical precision that shocked investigators in Los Angeles had appeared before, in Cleveland, Chicago, and other cities where similar crimes were unsolved, including the Cleveland Butcher, who operated between 1934 and 1938. And they had 12 victims who were dismembered using advanced surgical techniques. And the investigation focused on Dr. Francis Sweeney, who disappears into a mental hospital system and is just never heard from again. And then the Los Angeles murder cluster, and this happened between 1943 and 1949, so in the same time zone as the Black Dahlia case. And these murders were also done with surgical expertise and complete exsanguation and theatrical body positioning. And then there was the Chicago connection, which was the lipstick murders, which happened in Chicago in 1946, which victims included Suzanne Degnan, who was dismembered using identical hemicorporectomy techniques. And the killer also demonstrated the same medical knowledge and theatrical staging. But even with all that, with all these suspects, with all these pretty good leads, we're left with nothing. And in October of 1949, Los Angeles County District Attorney William E. Simpson conveyed a grand jury to investigate the Black Dahlia case, acknowledging what everyone already knew, and that is that the LAPD investigation had failed catastrophically. So the grand jury would spend 18 months examining evidence and interviewing witnesses and reviewing investigative procedures. and their final report would be released on April 1951. And it just documented a comedy of errors that were completely laughable because evidence had been lost, misfiled, or damaged through improper storage. Crime scene photographs showed contamination from the first hours of investigation, and witness statements contained contradictions that were never resolved. And there was detective notes that completely disappeared from files without explanation. And as we know, the media had compromised this investigation from day one, publishing information that allowed the killer to stay ahead of police efforts. And there was also the false confessions that had completely consumed investigative resources and that should have been pursuing legitimate leads. And the most damaging of all was that the grand jury discovered that the certain high-profile suspects had received protection from investigation due to political connections and financial influence. So the Black Dahlia case hadn't just gone unsolved. It had been sabotaged by incompetence, corruption, and a system that prioritized publicity over justice. So by 1960, curious detectives attempting to review the Black Dahlia case discovered that the key pieces of physical evidence had disappeared from the LAPD storage facilities completely. And those included crime scene photographs, Elizabeth Short's personal effects that were returned by the killer, plaster casts of footprints found at the scene, laboratory reports analyzing blood traces and fiber samples, and the evidence hadn't been destroyed through official channels or transferred to other jurisdictions. It had just simply vanished, leaving investigators with incomplete files and fading memories. So what remained told the story of investigative failure rather than criminal success. Hundreds of false leads, thousands of witness statements that led to nowhere, and decades of speculation that generated publicity rather than answers. And the Black Dahlia murder just became a case study in how to not conduct a homicide investigation. Because every mistake, literally every mistake that could have been made was made in this case. And every procedure that could have been corrupted had been corrupted. So the Black Dahlia case changed criminal investigation procedures nationwide, and crime scene preservation protocols emerged directly from the Norton Avenue disaster, and media relation guidelines developed to prevent journalistic interference as well, and evidence storage procedures improved to prevent mysterious disappearances that plagued the Short case specifically. And most importantly, the investigation's failure demonstrated that publicity could be more dangerous than helpful in complex cases. And Elizabeth Short's murder became required reading at police academies. Not as successful detective work, of course, but as a cautionary tale about everything that could go wrong when ego, incompetence, and corruption converged around a high-profile crime. And the case also revealed something darker about post-war American society, and that is that public fascination with Elizabeth Short's torture and mutilation suggested that there was appetites that transcended normal interest in criminal justice, and that Black Dahlia became entertainment rather than just a tragedy. And Detective Harry Hansen retired in 1968 without solving the case that defined his career. And in his final interview, he admitted, quote unquote,
"We never came close. Not really. Whoever killed that girl was smarter than all of us."
And the Black Dahlia investigation ended with recognition that some crimes just transcend the capabilities of their time. And Elizabeth Short's killer understood the limitation and exploited it with surgical precision. So the Black Dahlia case occupies a unique position in American criminal justice. It's too famous to ignore and too compromised to solve. And most experts acknowledge that the case will never be solved through conventional means. Physical evidence has degraded beyond forensic usefulness, witnesses have died, suspects have been buried for decades, and legal standards of proof remain impossibly high for circumstantial cases. But justice extends beyond legal conviction, and Elizabeth Short's murder sparked improvements in crime scene preservation, evidence handling, and media relations that have helped solve thousands of subsequent cases. But at the end of the day, the woman who wanted to be remembered as a famous actress became America's most famous murder victim instead. But I'm going to choose to remember her as Betty, the girl who chose to chase her dreams and had her life taken away. That is the end of the video. If you want to give me any other cases to deep dive into, let me know down below. I always read your comments. This was kind of a little Saturday bonus video. It was supposed to be short. It was not at all. So there's that, but I appreciate you hanging around. Please be safe out there, and I will see your beautiful face in the next video, okay? Bye.